This cruise is for successful family only, my mother declared, her voice carrying across the quiet luxury of the marina lobby. I simply pulled out my matte black keycard and smiled. Well, it is my yacht, I replied. I watched the glossy boarding passes literally slip from my sister-in-law's fingers and flutter to the marble floor. My name is Camille. I am 35 years old, and I recently learned that the people who share your blood will happily drown you if it means they can use your body as a raft. If you have ever been the black sheep of your family, the one who had to build your own table because they refused to give you a seat, stay with me. You will want to hear exactly how this family vacation ended. The air conditioning inside the ultra-exclusive VIP boarding lounge of the Miami Marina was crisp, smelling of sea salt and expensive citrus perfume. I stood near the frosted glass entrance holding my simple leather tote bag, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart. I had barely stepped foot onto the imported Italian marble floor when my mother Brenda intercepted me. She moved with that terrifying, frantic energy she always reserved for moments when she felt her carefully curated upper-middle-class Atlanta image was being threatened. She wore a pristine white resort dress, her hair pressed into an immaculate bob, and her face was twisted into a mask of pure fury. Before I could even say hello, she aggressively stepped into my personal space, blocking my path deeper into the lounge. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a crisp $500 bill, and slapped it directly against my chest. The bill fluttered down, and I had to catch it against my blouse just to keep it from falling. "Take a cab back to whatever little boat cleaning gig you are working down here," she hissed, her voice a harsh whisper that still managed to carry to the nearby patrons. "Do not do this to us today, Camille. We are not doing this." I looked at the money in my hand, and then up at the woman who gave birth to me. The patrons in the lounge, predominantly wealthy older white couples, were beginning to turn their heads, pretending not to watch the sudden spectacle. My mother had always cared more about the opinions of strangers than the feelings of her own daughter. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta, I was constantly reminded that my hustle was an embarrassment to her. While she wanted a daughter who attended the right cotillions, married a doctor, and hosted charity luncheons, I was the girl with dirt under her fingernails, always working, always building something out of nothing. She spent my entire life treating my ambition as a character flaw. "I am not here to clean boats, Mom," I said, keeping my voice absolutely level. "I came because I saw the booking under our family name." "Do not lie to me," Brenda snapped, stepping closer. "You saw pictures on social media, and you came down here looking for a handout. Well, you are not ruining this trip. Your brother worked too hard for this. Take the money and leave before you embarrass us in front of the marina staff." I held the $500 bill out, offering it back to her. "I do not want your money. I just want to know why my entire family flew to Miami for a luxury cruise and decided to leave me off the group chat." Brenda refused to take the bill back. Instead, her hand darted out, and her manicured fingers gripped my wrist with surprising strength. Her nails dug into my skin. "If you do not turn around and walk out those doors right now, I will call security and have the hired help throw you out," she threatened, her eyes wide with panic. "I will not let you ruin this before Trevon sees you." I looked down at her hand on my wrist. For 35 years, I had let this woman dictate my worth. I had let her convince me that my natural hair, my practical clothes, and my relentless work ethic made me less valuable than the pristine, fragile image she projected to her church friends. But I was not that scared little girl seeking her approval anymore. I gently but firmly peeled her fingers off my wrist. "You do not need to call security, Mom," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "I will go say hello to Trevon myself." I stepped around her, leaving her sputtering in shock, and walked deeper into the expansive lounge. The space was designed for ultimate luxury, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the private docks, where massive multi-million-dollar yachts bobbed gently in the turquoise water. And there, lounging on a plush circular leather sofa, right in the center of the room, was my younger brother Trevon. Trevon was 32 years old and the undisputed golden child of the Washington family. He was wearing a custom linen suit unbuttoned at the collar, looking every bit the successful corporate executive he desperately wanted people to believe he was. He was swirling vintage champagne in a crystal flute holding court. Beside him sat his wife Jessica. Jessica was a wealthy white woman from a prominent Savannah family who had always looked at me like I was an unpleasant stain on her expensive upholstery. As I approached the seating area, Jessica spotted me first. Her perfectly glossed lips curled into a sneer. "Trevon." She sighed loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Why is your sister here? I thought we agreed this was a high-level family trip. Her ghetto presence is literally embarrassing us in front of the concierge." Jessica weaponized her privilege effortlessly, using words like ghetto to describe me, simply because I wore a tailored pantsuit instead of resort wear and carried myself with a quiet authority rather than loud entitlement. Trevon turned his head, his smile vanishing the moment his eyes locked onto mine. He set his champagne flute down heavily on the glass table. "Camille, what are you doing here?" Trevon demanded, refusing to stand up to greet me. "Mom tried to pay me $500 to leave," I said, dropping the crisp bill onto the table next to his champagne. I figured I would come ask the host of this fabulous trip why his only sister was uninvited. Trevon leaned back, crossing his arms with incredible arrogance. "Because we are celebrating my recent VP promotion at the investment firm," he announced, making sure his voice projected across the lounge. "I chartered a $150,000 luxury yacht to treat my parents to the vacation they deserve. We wanted a peaceful, elevated environment. Having you here constantly talking about your struggles or asking for loans just does not fit the aesthetic of this trip." The audacity of his words hit me like a physical blow, but I refused to show it. My parents had walked up behind me now, forming a united front with my brother. My father, Calvin, finally spoke. Calvin was a quiet man, but his silence had always been an active choice to enable my mother and brother. "Your brother is doing big things," Camille, my father said, placing a proud hand on Trevon's shoulder. "He is the only one who made something of the family name. We just wanted 1 week to celebrate his corporate success without any drama." I looked at my father, the man who 10 years ago sat at our kitchen table and flatly refused to co-sign a $50,000 business loan for me. I had come to him with a meticulously researched business plan, a solid credit score, and a desperate plea for a chance. He had told me then that giving money to a woman with pipe dreams was a bad investment. Yet over the last decade, I knew for a fact he had bailed Trevon out of 2 wrecked luxury cars, a mountain of credit card debt, and a failed startup attempt. "So my lifestyle is too mediocre for this luxury trip?" I asked, keeping my tone dangerously calm. Trevon scoffed, picking up his champagne again. "Look, Camille, you chose your path. You want to hustle in the dirt, cleaning boats and running whatever little side gigs you do, that is fine. But this is the big leagues. We are dealing with Azure Seas charters. This is for successful family only." He reached into his designer pocket, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and tossed it so it landed on the floor, right at the tip of my leather loafers. "There is for the bus ride back to your apartment," he sneered. Jessica giggled, leaning her head on his shoulder. The lounge felt entirely still. I could feel the collective breath of my family waiting for me to break. They expected the familiar routine. They expected me to raise my voice, to cry, to storm out in a cloud of bitter resentment, so they could shake their heads and validate their narrative that I was unstable and jealous. Instead, I looked down at the $20 bill on the marble floor. A strange, absolute calm washed over my entire body. I looked back up at Trevon, then at Jessica, then at my parents. I smiled. It was a cold, genuine smile that made my mother take a sudden, uncertain step backward. I slowly reached my hand into my designer tote bag. My fingers closed around the smooth, cool plastic of my keycard. I pulled it out and held it up between my index and middle finger. It was a matte black master keycard, thick and heavy, bearing the gold-embossed insignia of Azure Seas Charters, the very same logo printed on the frosted glass doors of the lounge. "You are absolutely right, Mom," I said, my voice ringing with crystal-clear authority. "This cruise is for successful family only, which is exactly why every single one of you is currently trespassing on my property." Trevon stared at the black card, then let out a loud, barking laugh. "Are you out of your mind?" he mocked, shaking his head. "Did you steal a housekeeper's keycard, Camille? Are you seriously trying to pretend you work for the marina now?" I did not have to answer him, because at that exact moment, the heavy mahogany double doors leading from the management offices swung wide open. 2 men stepped through the heavy mahogany doors. One was the harbor master in a sharply tailored navy suit. The other was Captain Sterling, a distinguished older black man with a neat gray beard who wore his crisp white uniform adorned with gold epaulettes, like a badge of honor. He was a decorated maritime veteran whose presence demanded immediate respect. Trevon stood up immediately. He smoothed his custom linen jacket and puffed out his chest, projecting that fake corporate authority he always used to intimidate people. Finally, Trevon said, his voice booming so the entire lounge would hear him. Captain, I am Trevon Washington. I chartered your flagship vessel, the Ocean Monarch, for the week. We are ready for priority boarding, and I expect top-tier service from my wife and my parents. Captain Sterling did not even slow his stride. He did not blink. He walked right past my brother as if Trevon were nothing more than a potted plant. The harbor master followed close behind, completely ignoring Trevon's outstretched hand. They marched with pure purpose right toward where I stood. They stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. Both men offered a deep, respectful bow of their heads. "Good afternoon, Madam CEO," Captain Sterling said, his voice carrying a warm but absolute deference. "The fleet is fully prepped and the crew is standing by for your final inspection before we release the vessel to the clients." The silence that fell over the VIP lounge was thick enough to choke on. I watched the rich brown color drain entirely from my brother's face, leaving him looking ashy and pale. His outstretched hand slowly dropped to his side. Beside him, Jessica let out a small, breathless gasp. Her jaw literally went slack. The glossy gold-trimmed boarding passes she had been clutching so tightly slipped right through her perfectly manicured fingers. They fluttered down, scattering across the polished marble floor like dead leaves falling from a dying tree. Madam CEO Trevon repeated the words, sounding like dry ash in his mouth. "Camille, what kind of sick joke is this? Tell them to stop playing around right now." "There is no joke, Trevon," I said, stepping forward. I gestured toward the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the marina, where dozens of massive multi-million-dollar yachts bobbed gently in the turquoise water. "You told me earlier that you were dealing with the big leagues. You said this cruise was for successful family only. Well, you are looking at the founder and sole owner of Azure Seas Charters. I do not just clean boats, Trevon. I own the entire fleet." My father, Calvin, gripped the edge of the leather sofa, looking like he might pass out. "But Camille, you told us you were just working in hospitality," he stammered. "You said you were managing guest relations down here in Miami." I looked at the man who had always enabled my brother's worst habits while ignoring my potential. "I am in hospitality, Dad," I replied, keeping my tone dangerously even. "I manage the relations of billionaires, celebrities, and corporate executives who charter my luxury vessels. 10 years ago, when you refused to co-sign that small business loan for me, you said giving money to a woman with pipe dreams was a bad investment. You told me to be realistic and get a regular job while you gladly paid off Trevon's massive credit card debt. So I stopped asking for your help. I stopped telling you my dreams. I moved down here, worked 4 different jobs, slept on a friend's couch, and built my empire quietly." I looked around the room, locking eyes with my mother. "When I was working 18-hour days, saving every dime I had, you all laughed at me. Mom, you told your entire prayer circle at our church in Atlanta that I was a lost cause because I refused to take a low-paying desk job just to say I worked in a nice office. You paraded Trevon around every Sunday dinner, bragging about his fancy suits and his empty corporate titles. You told me I was embarrassing the family name. Meanwhile, I was down here building a maritime empire from scratch. I bought my first small vessel, so then a second, then I acquired this entire luxury charter company." Jessica was shaking her head, her blonde hair falling in front of her face as she stared at the scattered boarding passes on the floor. "This makes no sense," she whispered, looking utterly humiliated. "The marina staff out there, the concierge, they all treated us like royalty because of Trevon. They gave us the absolute best VIP treatment." "They treated you like royalty because my system flagged your last name," I corrected her smoothly, taking immense satisfaction in dismantling her privileged assumptions. "The staff knows my maiden name is Washington. When they saw a Trevon Washington on the passenger manifest, they assumed you were my beloved family coming down for a private getaway. They gave you the VIP lounge access because of my name, Jessica, not your husband's fake promotion. You are sitting on that sofa right now solely because of my hard work. Trevin looked like a cornered animal. His chest heaved as he tried to process that the sister he had spent his entire life mocking was actually the millionaire standing at the top of the food chain. He looked around the lounge at the wealthy patrons who were now openly watching our drama unfold. His fragile ego simply could not handle the public dismantling of his wealthy persona. "This is a lie," Trevon shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are lying. You probably just managed the front desk and convinced these guys to play along to embarrass me. You have always been jealous of my success. You have always wanted what I have." Captain Sterling stepped forward, his posture rigid and highly protective. "Sir, I would advise you to lower your voice when speaking to my employer," he said with military precision. "Ms. Washington owns this entire maritime operation. If you continue to cause a disturbance in her private lounge, I will have security escort you off the premises immediately." The reality of the situation finally crashed down on them. The undeniable truth was staring them right in the face. I had not come to beg for a spot on their lavish vacation. I owned the vacation. I owned the very ground they were standing on. I watched my mother Brenda process this information. I could practically see the gears grinding in her head. For 35 years, she had built her entire identity around being the mother of a highly successful corporate son while actively hiding her disappointing daughter in the background. Now her entire worldview had been shattered in front of her high society peers and wealthy strangers. But Brenda was a master manipulator. She was a survivalist who always knew exactly how to spin a narrative to her advantage. Instead of apologizing or showing any genuine remorse, her face suddenly broke into a massive theatrical smile. She let out a loud, exaggerated laugh that echoed off the high ceilings, sounding completely unhinged given the circumstances. "Oh my goodness!" she exclaimed, clapping her hands together tightly. She stepped forward, throwing her arms open wide as if she wanted to embrace the daughter she had just offered $500 to leave. "I knew it. I knew it all along." I stepped back, crossing my arms and refusing to let her touch me. "You knew what, Mom?" I asked, my voice dripping with cold skepticism. Brenda turned to the other patrons in the lounge, projecting her voice so everyone could hear her performance. "Oh, do not mind us, everyone. It is just a wonderful family surprise." She looked back at Trevin and Calvin, her eyes wide with fake excitement. "I have been keeping Camille's brilliant secret for months. She told me all about her little business venture taking off. We planned this whole setup today just to surprise you, Trevon. We wanted to show you how incredibly well your big sister is doing down here." I stared at my mother, letting her hollow words hang in the crisp air of the luxury lounge. She stood there with her arms wide open, wearing that forced beauty pageant smile, silently begging me to play along. She wanted me to be the compliant daughter just this once to save her from the ultimate social humiliation. For a fraction of a second, I remembered being 16 years old, taking the blame when Trayvon scratched my father's sedan, because Brenda convinced me that protecting my brother was my duty as a black woman. She had spent my entire life grooming me to be the human shield for her golden child. But that version of me was dead and buried. I did not raise my voice, but I made sure my words carried clear across the polished marble floor. "Stop lying, Mom," I said. "We did not plan anything together. You have not called me in 4 months. 5 minutes ago, you threw $500 at me and told me to go back to cleaning boats because my presence was embarrassing you. Do not try to attach yourself to my success now that your golden boy is looking like an absolute fool." Brenda's fake smile shattered into a million pieces. Her arms dropped limply to her sides and she let out a quiet, indignant gasp. She looked around at the wealthy patrons who were now openly whispering and pointing in our direction. Her carefully curated high society Atlanta image was dissolving in real time, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Trevon could not handle the sudden shift in power. His entire identity was built on being the alpha male, the corporate prodigy, the one who made the family proud. Seeing me, a woman he had relentlessly mocked, standing in a position of absolute authority over him, made him snap. He stepped in front of our mother, trying to physically block me from view, as if his broad shoulders could somehow hide my ownership of the entire marina. "All right, fine," Trevin said, his voice loud and aggressively defensive. "You own the boats. Good for you, Camille. I am glad all those years of scrubbing decks finally paid off." But let us get down to real business. Since my own flesh and blood owns Azure Seas Charters, then there is absolutely no reason for me to be paying retail price for a family vacation. I tilted my head watching him dig his own grave with remarkable speed. Is that right? I asked. Exactly. Trevon puffed his chest out, adjusting his custom linen lapels. Family takes care of family. That is how we were raised. I just dropped $150,000 to charter the Ocean Monarch for the week. Since you are the owner and my big sister, you can go ahead and authorize a full refund to my bank account immediately. We will still take the yacht to the Bahamas, of course. Consider it your contribution to the family. You owe us that much for causing this massive scene. I actually laughed out loud. It was a short, sharp sound of pure, unadulterated disbelief. The sheer audacity of this man was staggering. When I was 25 and starting my first catering business, I begged him to let me cater a small networking event for his firm, just to get my name out there. He told me my food was too unrefined for his corporate clients and hired a high-end white-owned company instead. When I needed a small loan to buy my first commercial property, he laughed in my face and told me to get a real job. Now he was demanding a free six-figure luxury cruise simply because we shared the same parents. I turned to the harbor master who was watching the exchange with professional detachment. Mr. Reynolds, I said, keeping my eyes locked on Trevon. Please hand me the digital manifest and financial logs for the Ocean Monarch charter. Right away, Madam CEO, the harbor master replied respectfully, handing me a sleek silver tablet. I took the tablet and swiped my finger across the screen, opening the secure financial portal of my company. Jessica, who had been standing frozen behind Trevon, suddenly found her voice. She crossed her arms, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. Trevon is right, Camille, she said, her tone dripping with that familiar old money condescension. It is incredibly tacky to charge your own brother for a family trip, especially when he has been so generous with his wealth. You should refund the wire transfer right now. It is the absolute least you can do after humiliating your mother like this. I ignored Jessica entirely, focusing my attention on the glowing screen of the tablet. Let us talk about this incredible generosity, I said, my voice projecting clearly so everyone in our immediate vicinity could hear. I am looking at the payment logs for this specific charter. A $150,000 booking requires a strict verification process. We do not just hand over the keys to a multi-million vessel without running thorough background checks and financial authorizations. Trevon shifted his weight uncomfortably. His eyes darted toward the exit doors, then back to the tablet in my hands. Just process the refund. Camille, he demanded, his voice losing some of its confident boom. Do not make this a whole corporate production. Just do it manually and let us get on the boat. I cannot do that, Trevon, I replied, tapping the screen. Because in order to refund a payment, I need to verify the original source of the funds. And looking at this file, things are getting very interesting very quickly. I began reading the payment history aloud, letting each word hang heavily in the quiet luxury lounge. On Tuesday the 14th at 10 in the morning, a primary payment attempt was made for the amount of $150,000. The payment method was a premium black card. Jessica smirked, leaning her head against Trevon's arm with a look of supreme validation. See, she boasted, looking around the room. My husband only uses the best. Stop dragging this out and return our money. You are just trying to make him look bad because you are jealous. I looked up from the tablet, staring dead into Jessica's eyes. The smirk on her face was so arrogant and so perfectly entitled. It brought me immense joy to wipe it away completely. I held her gaze, refusing to let her look away. I would love to return the money, Jessica, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. But Trevon did not pay with his own black card. In fact, Trevon did not pay with his own money at all. The name on the primary card attempted for this transaction was not Trevon Washington. It was Charles Montgomery. Jessica's face instantly drained of color. Her mouth fell open as the name registered in her mind. Charles Montgomery was her father. What she breathed, stepping away from Trevon, as if he had burned her. Trevon, what is she talking about? Why did you use my father's card? You said you paid for this trip with your executive bonus. You promised me you used your own money. I did not stop. I kept my eyes locked on Jessica, delivering the final crushing blow that would shatter their perfect illusion. And to make matters worse, Jessica, the transaction did not even go through. Your father's black card was immediately declined by the issuing bank for insufficient funds. The lounge went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Jessica backed away from Trevon, her face twisting from shock into absolute fury. Insufficient funds, she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. What do you mean, insufficient funds? My father's card has no limit. Trevon, what is she talking about? Trevon was sweating now. Actual beads of perspiration formed on his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled image. He reached out, trying to grab Jessica's arm, but she slapped his hand away. Baby, just calm down, he stammered, looking frantically around the room. There was a glitch with the bank. It was just a security hold. I took care of it. I did not let him spin his web of lies. You did take care of it, Trevon, I said, projecting my voice so my parents could hear every single word. When the primary card declined, my finance team contacted you, informing you that the $150,000 charter fee needed to be paid in full, or the reservation would be canceled. You panicked. You needed to maintain this illusion of being a wealthy executive so desperately that you resorted to wire fraud. My father, Calvin, stepped forward, his brow deeply furrowed. Wire fraud. He repeated, his voice trembling slightly. Camille, what are you saying? Your brother makes mid-six figures. He does not need to commit fraud. I turned my gaze to the man who had spent his entire life telling me I was not smart enough to handle real business. Dad, Trevon does not make mid-six figures, I explained, keeping my tone clinical and detached. I ran a background compliance check on the funds because of the size of the transaction. Trevon is not a vice president at his investment firm. He is a mid-level analyst who has been drowning in debt for years, trying to keep up with Jessica's old money lifestyle. Jessica let out a loud, dramatic sob, covering her face with her hands. Trevon looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. But he paid for the yacht! Brenda interjected, her voice shrill and desperate. She was clinging to her golden child's image like a life raft. He paid for it, Camille. The reservation is in the system. You just want to ruin his day because you are bitter. I did pay for it, Mom, I said, tapping the screen of my tablet to bring up the wire transfer authorization documents. When the credit card declined, Trevon initiated a direct wire transfer for the full amount the very next morning. But because he did not have the liquid cash, he secured a rapid high-interest personal loan from a predatory lending group. And in order to secure a loan of that size, with his terrible credit score, he needed collateral. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over them. I looked directly at my father. Calvin had worked for 40 years, pulling double shifts to pay off their beautiful 4-bedroom brick home in Atlanta. It was his pride and joy, his only real asset for retirement. The very same house he told me I would never be able to afford. Dad, I said softly, watching his face. The collateral Trevon used to secure the loan was the deed to your house. The color drained entirely from my father's face. He swayed on his feet, bringing a hand up to clutch his chest, what he whispered, the word barely making it past his lips. I read directly from the legal document on my screen. The loan was collateralized against the property on Oakwood Drive, Atlanta, Georgia. The signature on the authorization form is listed as Calvin Washington. But we all know you did not sign that paper, Dad. Trevon forged your signature to take out a second mortgage on your fully paid-off retirement home just to fund a fake luxury vacation to impress his wife. A collective gasp rippled through the VIP lounge. The wealthy patrons who had been watching this drama unfold were now staring at Trevon with absolute disgust. The golden child, the supposed pride of the Washington family, had just been exposed as a common thief. Brenda shook her head violently, her immaculate hair falling out of place. No, she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at me. You are lying. You fabricated these documents to ruin him. Trevon, tell her she is lying. Tell your father you did not touch our house. Trevon could not look our parents in the eye. He stared at his expensive Italian leather shoes, his chest heaving. Mom, I just needed to borrow the money for a little while. He mumbled, his voice completely devoid of its earlier arrogance. I was going to pay it back after my annual review. I just needed to show Jessica's family that I was on their level. It was an investment in my image. Calvin let out a sound that was half sob, half groan. He collapsed onto the nearest chair, holding his head in his hands. 10 years ago, when I begged him for a $50,000 loan to buy my first commercial boat, he told me that lending money to family was a sure way to end up in the poorhouse. He told me I was not responsible enough to handle that kind of capital. He said women like me needed to stick to safe hourly jobs. Yet he had spent the last decade bailing Trayvon out of every financial disaster, blindly trusting a son who had just secretly signed away the roof over his parents' heads. "You stole our home," Calvin choked out, looking at his golden boy with shattered eyes. "I worked my entire life for that house, Trayvon. I paid it off so your mother and I would have somewhere safe to grow old. And you gambled it away for a boat ride." Jessica was pacing back and forth, furiously tapping on her designer phone. "I am calling my father," she shrieked, ignoring Calvin's devastation entirely. "I am calling my lawyer. You are completely broke, Trayvon. You lied to me since the day we met. You told me you had a trust fund. You told me your parents were wealthy real estate investors. You are nothing but a fraud." Brenda rushed to Trevon's side, wrapping her arms around him in a desperate, toxic display of enabling. "It is going to be okay, baby," she cooed, glaring at me with pure hatred. "We will figure this out. We always do. Your sister is just being cruel by doing this in public. She has always been a hateful girl." She turned her wrath on me, her voice vibrating with malice. "Are you happy now, Camille? Are you satisfied that you have destroyed your brother's marriage and humiliated your family? You could have pulled us aside privately. You could have fixed this for him quietly. You have all this money now, and you choose to use it to tear your own blood down. You are a disgrace to this family." I stood tall, refusing to shrink under her toxic guilt trip. "I did not destroy anything, Mom. Trayvon destroyed his own life with his greed, and I did not bring this into the public eye. You did. You were the one who slapped money on my chest and yelled at me to leave in front of 50 strangers. You wanted a public spectacle to put me in my place. You just do not like the fact that I am the one controlling the narrative now." Trayvon suddenly snapped. The humiliation, the impending divorce, the realization that his entire fake life was over, pushed him into a blind rage. He shoved his mother aside and lunged forward, closing the distance between us in 2 rapid strides. "Shut your mouth," he roared, raising his hand as if he were going to strike me or snatch the tablet from my grip. "I paid for the damn boat. I signed the paperwork. You are going to tell the captain to let us board right now, Camille. I am not leaving here looking like a fool. You owe me this. You owe this family." I was inches from my face, his breath smelling of expensive champagne and desperation. 10 years ago, I would have flinched. I would have backed down to keep the peace. I would have let him take whatever he wanted just to stop the yelling. But I did not flinch. I did not even blink. I held his furious gaze, keeping my posture completely relaxed and rooted in my own power. I slowly raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once. The sharp sound echoed through the tense silence of the lounge. Instantly, the heavy mahogany doors behind me opened wider, and 4 massive armed maritime security guards stepped out of the shadows, moving with tactical precision. The silence that blanketed the VIP lounge was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that only happens when a meticulously constructed lie shatters in front of an audience. Jessica stepped away from Trayvon, as if the custom linen suit he wore had suddenly caught fire. Her face contorted, moving rapidly from perfectly polished confusion into raw, unfiltered fury. "Insufficient funds!" Jessica shrieked, her voice entirely stripped of its usual soft Southern belle restraint. She threw her hands in the air, the diamond tennis bracelet, catching the bright overhead light. "What on earth do you mean, insufficient funds? My father's card does not have a limit. Trayvon, what is she talking about? Why did you even have my father's card?" Trayvon was sweating now. Actual visible beads of perspiration were forming along his hairline, ruining his perfectly groomed executive aesthetic. He reached out, trying to grab Jessica's arm to quiet her down, but she violently slapped his hand away. "Baby, just lower your voice," Trayvon stammered, darting frantic looks around the lounge. The wealthy patrons who had previously been ignoring us were now watching with undisguised fascination. There was a glitch with the bank. It was just a security hold because of the high transaction amount. I took care of it immediately. I did not let him breathe. I did not let him spin a new web of toxic gaslighting. "You did take care of it, Trayvon." I said, projecting my voice so my parents could hear every single razor-sharp syllable. When the primary card declined, my finance team contacted you directly. They informed you that the $150,000 charter fee needed to be paid in full within 24 hours, or the reservation would be permanently canceled. You panicked. You needed to maintain this grand illusion of being a wealthy executive so desperately that you resorted to wire fraud. My father. Calvin stepped forward, his brow deeply furrowed. The proud posture he had carried into the lounge was beginning to collapse. Wire fraud, he repeated, his voice trembling slightly. Camille, what are you saying right now? Your brother makes mid-six figures. He does not need to commit fraud for a vacation. I turned my gaze to the man who had spent my entire life telling me I was not smart enough to handle real business. Dad Trevin does not make mid-six figures, I explained, keeping my tone clinical and completely detached from the emotion radiating off of him. I ran a mandatory background compliance check on the source of the funds because of the massive size of the transaction. Trevon is not a vice president at his Atlanta investment firm. He is a mid-level analyst, and he has been drowning in extreme debt for years trying to keep up with Jessica's old money lifestyle. Jessica let out a loud, dramatic gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Trevon looked like he wanted the marble floor to open up and swallow him whole. But he paid for the yacht! Brenda interjected, her voice shrill and desperate. She rushed to stand beside her son, physically clinging to her golden child's arm like a life raft. He paid for it, Camille. The reservation is in the system. You just want to ruin his special day because you are bitter, and you have always been bitter. I did pay for it, Mom, I said, tapping the screen of my tablet to bring up the encrypted wire transfer authorization documents. When the credit card declined, Trevon initiated a direct wire transfer for the full amount the very next morning. But because he did not have $150,000 in liquid cash, he secured a rapid, high-interest personal loan from a predatory lending group. And in order to secure a loan of that massive size with his terrible credit score, he needed heavy collateral. I paused, letting the terrible weight of my words settle over the four of them. I looked directly into my father's eyes. Calvin had worked for 40 years pulling brutal double shifts at the distribution center to pay off their beautiful 4-bedroom brick home in Atlanta. That house was his pride and joy. It was his only real asset for retirement. It was the very same house he constantly reminded me I would never be able to afford with my lifestyle choices. Dad, I said softly, watching his face. The collateral Trevon used to secure the loan was the deed to your house. The rich brown color drained entirely from my father's face, leaving him looking pale and completely hollow. He swayed on his feet, bringing a shaking hand up to clutch the fabric over his chest. What he whispered, the word barely making it past his lips. I read directly from the verified legal document glowing on my screen. The loan was collateralized against the residential property on Oakwood Drive, Atlanta, Georgia. The signature on the authorization form is listed as Calvin Washington. But we all know you did not sign that paper, Dad. Trevon forged your signature to take out a massive second mortgage on your fully paid-off retirement home. He did all of this just to fund a fake luxury vacation to impress his wife. A collective gasp rippled through the VIP lounge. The spectators watching this drama unfold were now staring at Trevon with absolute disgust. The golden child, the supposed pride and joy of the Washington family, had just been exposed as a common thief. Brenda shook her head violently, her immaculate hair falling out of place. No, she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at me. You are lying. You fabricated these documents to ruin him. Trevon, tell her she is lying. Tell your father you did not touch our house. Trevon could not look our parents in the eye. He stared down at his expensive Italian leather shoes, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. Mom, I just needed to borrow the equity for a little while. He mumbled, his voice completely devoid of its earlier booming arrogance. I was going to pay it back after my annual review at the firm. I just needed to show Jessica's family that I was on their level. It was an investment in my corporate image. Calvin let out a sound that was half sob and half groan. He collapsed backward onto the nearest leather chair, holding his head in his hands. 10 years ago, when I stood in their kitchen and begged him for a $50,000 loan to buy my first commercial boat, he told me that lending money to family was a sure way to end up in the poorhouse. He told me I was not responsible enough to handle that kind of capital. He looked me in the eye and said, "Black women like me needed to stick to safe hourly jobs instead of chasing risky fantasies." Yet he had spent the last decade bailing Trevon out of every financial disaster, blindly trusting a son who had just secretly signed away the roof over his parents' heads. "You stole our home," Calvin choked out, looking at his golden boy with utterly shattered eyes. "I worked my entire life for that house, Trevon. I paid it off so your mother and I would have somewhere safe to grow old, and you gambled it away for a boat ride." Jessica was pacing back and forth, furiously tapping on the screen of her designer phone. "I am calling my father!" she shrieked, ignoring Calvin's devastation entirely. "I am calling my family lawyer right now. You are completely broke, Trevon. You have lied to me since the day we met. You told me you had a trust fund. You told me your parents were wealthy real estate investors. You are nothing but a broke fraud." Brenda rushed to Trevon's side, wrapping her arms around his shoulders in a desperate, toxic display of enabling. "It is going to be okay, baby," she cooed aggressively, glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "We will figure this out. We always do. Your sister is just being cruel by doing this in public. She has always been a hateful, vindictive girl." She turned her full wrath on me, her voice vibrating with malice. "Are you happy now, Camille? Are you satisfied that you have destroyed your brother's marriage and humiliated your family? You could have pulled us aside privately. You could have fixed this for him quietly like a good sister. You have all this money now, and you choose to use it to tear your own blood down. You are an absolute disgrace to this family." I stood perfectly tall, refusing to shrink under her toxic guilt trip. "I did not destroy anything, Mom," I said, my voice ringing with authority. "Trevon destroyed his own life with his greed, and I did not bring this into the public eye. You did. You were the one who slapped money on my chest and yelled at me to leave in front of 50 strangers. You wanted a massive public spectacle to put me in my place. You just do not like the fact that I am the one controlling the narrative now." Trevon suddenly snapped. The public humiliation, the impending divorce, and the realization that his entire fake high society life was over pushed him into a blind, chaotic rage. He shoved his mother aside and lunged forward, closing the distance between us in 2 rapid, heavy strides. "Shut your mouth!" he roared, raising his hand as if he were going to physically strike me or snatch the tablet right out of my grip. "I paid for the damn boat. I signed the paperwork. You are going to tell the captain to let us board right now, Camille. I am not leaving here looking like a fool in front of my wife. You owe me this. You owe this family." I was inches from my face, his breath smelling of expensive champagne and pure desperation. 10 years ago, I would have flinched. I would have backed down and made myself small to keep the peace. I would have let him take whatever he wanted just to stop the yelling. But I did not flinch. I did not even blink. I held his furious gaze, keeping my posture completely relaxed and rooted in my own absolute power. I slowly raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once. The sharp sound echoed through the tense silence of the lounge. Instantly, the heavy mahogany doors behind me swung fully open, and 4 massive armed maritime security guards stepped out of the shadows, moving with flawless tactical precision. The 4 men moved with a synchronized heavy precision that instantly sucked the air right out of the room. Tyson, my lead head of security, a 6'4" brick wall of a man, stepped directly in front of me. He did not say a single word. He simply placed one massive hand flat against Trevon's chest and shoved him backward with enough calculated force to send my brother stumbling over his own expensive Italian loafers. Trevon hit the edge of the glass coffee table hard, his arms flailing as he barely kept himself from crashing to the marble floor. The physical intimidation tactic Trevon had relied on his entire life completely evaporated. He was used to towering over me, used to raising his voice and using his size to force me into submission, while my parents watched and did nothing. But standing in front of Tyson and 3 other highly trained maritime security guards, Trevon suddenly looked exactly like what he was. A frightened broke man playing dress-up in a borrowed suit. That was the exact moment Brenda completely lost her mind. Seeing her golden child physically pushed back, seeing the absolute failure of his aggressive posturing, triggered something unhinged inside my mother. She threw a massive theatrical tantrum right in the middle of the luxury lounge. It was a performance designed purely to draw maximum attention and sympathy from the wealthy, predominantly white patrons watching our every move. She stomped her foot against the floor and pointed a shaking, manicured finger at my face. "You vindictive, bitter spinster!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet elegance of the room. "You have always been jealous of him. Always. You are just furious because no man wants to deal with your difficult attitude, so you have to work yourself to the bone while Trevon gets to live a beautiful life with a beautiful wife. You fabricated all of this nonsense just to humiliate him because you cannot stand seeing him happy." I stood completely still, securely positioned behind the broad shoulders of my security team. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not try to defend my relationship status or my work ethic. I just watched her unravel. Calvin tried to reach for her arm to calm her down, but she violently shook him off. She was too far gone, operating on pure toxic adrenaline. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone. Her hands were shaking with rage as she tapped the screen. "You want to play power games with us, Camille?" she yelled, holding the phone up like a weapon. "Let us see how powerful you feel when you are sitting in the back of a squad car. I am calling the police. I am going to have you locked up for fraud and assault. You cannot just forge documents and trap us in here with your hired thugs." Tyson glanced back at me over his shoulder, raising one eyebrow in a silent question, asking if he should intervene and confiscate her phone. I gave him a subtle shake of my head. "Let her talk, Tyson," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "Let her dig the hole as deep as she wants." Brenda dialed 911 and pressed the phone to her ear. The transformation that occurred in the next 3 seconds was a chilling masterclass in manipulation. The moment the dispatcher answered the line, Brenda's vicious screaming instantly vanished. Her voice dropped into a fragile, weeping quiver. She sounded like a terrified, helpless victim. "Help us, please," she cried into the receiver, forcing a sob into her throat. "We are at the Azure Seas Marina VIP lounge in Miami. An employee here has gone completely crazy. She is threatening my successful son and his wife. She has armed men holding us hostage, and she is trying to extort money from us. Please hurry, she is deranged and we are terrified for our lives." I stood there and listened to the woman who gave birth to me weaponize the police against her own daughter. In our community, calling the police on a family member carries a heavy, potentially deadly weight. Brenda knew exactly what could have happened to a black woman accused of being deranged and aggressive by a frantic caller. She knew the risks, and she simply did not care. She was willing to put my freedom and my life in absolute jeopardy just to protect Trevon's fragile ego and avoid facing the reality of his massive financial crimes. It was the ultimate profound betrayal. It severed whatever microscopic thread of lingering affection I still held for her. Jessica watched Brenda weeping into the phone, her own face pale with shock. Even Jessica, who had spent the last hour complaining about my presence, seemed disturbed by the sheer magnitude of Brenda's fabricated hysteria. She took another step away from my family, clutching her purse tightly to her chest. Captain Sterling, who had been standing quietly to the side observing the chaos, stepped forward. "Madam CEO," he said, his voice low and respectful. "Should I have the marina gates locked down? The local authorities will be arriving shortly, and we need to ensure the perimeter is secure." "No, Captain," I replied, keeping my eyes locked on my mother. "Keep the gates wide open. We have nothing to hide here." Trevon, hearing his mother command the 911 dispatcher to send units immediately, suddenly straightened his posture. The fear that had gripped him moments ago when Tyson shoved him vanished. It was replaced by that familiar, sickeningly arrogant smirk. He actually believed her performance was going to work. He believed the police would arrive, see his tailored linen suit, see his weeping mother, and his distressed white wife, and immediately assume that I was exactly what Brenda claimed. An unstable, bitter employee, causing a dangerous disturbance. He thought the systemic biases of the world would magically align to protect his polished aesthetic while punishing my quiet authority. "You really pushed it too far this time," Camille Trevon said, crossing his arms over his chest. His voice was dripping with smug satisfaction. "You thought you could just flash a fake keycard and hire some muscle to intimidate us. Mom is right. You have always been insanely jealous of me, and now you are going to jail for it. You should have just walked away and gone back to your little apartment when Mom gave you that money. Now you are done." I did not respond to his taunts. I did not waste my breath trying to explain the reality of the situation to a man who was stubbornly committed to his own delusions. I simply stood my ground, surrounded by the tangible proof of the empire I had built with my own two hands. The patrons in the lounge were absolutely captivated by the spectacle. Several people had pulled out their phones and were quietly recording the scene from the safety of their tables. My family was so consumed by their own arrogance that they did not even realize their public humiliation was being digitally immortalized. They thought they were controlling the room, but they were just providing free entertainment for the very high society crowd they so desperately wanted to impress. Through the thick, soundproof glass windows of the luxury lounge, the faint sound of sirens began to bleed into the room. The high-pitched wail was distant at first, but it was growing rapidly louder, echoing across the waterfront. Trevin's smirk widened into a full-blown grin of pure triumph. He looked at the heavy mahogany doors, expecting local beat cops to burst in and drag me away in handcuffs. He looked back at me, his eyes shining with arrogant victory. I simply checked my watch. Exactly 10 seconds later, the heavy glass doors of the main marina lobby slid open. My mother immediately snapped back into her performance. She let out a loud theatrical sob and rushed toward the entrance, waving her arms frantically. "Thank God you are here," she cried out, her voice dripping with fake terror. "This woman is completely unhinged. She is holding us hostage and trying to extort my son. Please, you have to arrest her before she hurts somebody." But the men striding through the doors did not look like local Miami beat cops responding to a frantic domestic disturbance call. They were not wearing standard blue uniforms. There were 4 of them dressed in sharp dark suits with tactical windbreakers over their dress shirts. The bright yellow letters printed across their jackets read, "FBI Financial Crimes Division." They did not even break their stride when Brenda approached them. The lead agent, a tall white man with a completely stoic expression, simply stepped around my weeping mother as if she were a minor obstacle on the sidewalk. He did not ask her if she was okay. He did not ask who had called 911. He bypassed her entirely and walked straight up to where my security team was standing. Tyson, my head of security, gave the federal agents a brief nod and stepped aside, clearing a direct path to my brother. Trevin Washington, the lead agent, asked, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority. Trevin could not speak. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The fake corporate confidence he had been projecting just minutes earlier had completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified little boy, caught in a lie. He looked back at Brenda, who was standing frozen near the entrance, her fake tears drying instantly on her cheeks, as she realized these men were not here to rescue her golden child. "I am Special Agent Miller," the man continued, pulling a badge from his jacket pocket. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest." Calvin stepped forward, his hands shaking wildly. "Wait there, must be some mistake," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "My son is a vice president at an investment firm in Atlanta. He is a successful man. You have the wrong person. He just paid for a luxury family vacation." I looked at my father, feeling a profound sense of pity for the deep well of denial he was drowning in. "There is no mistake, Dad," I said, my voice breaking through the heavy silence of the room. "I told you Trevon is not a vice president. He never was. That entire promotion was a total fabrication." Trevin looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading silently, begging me to stop talking. But I had spent 35 years swallowing my voice to protect his fragile ego, and I was entirely done protecting him. When you operate a multinational luxury charter company dealing with billionaires and foreign dignitaries, your financial compliance has to be absolutely flawless, I explained, pacing slowly in front of the leather sofa. "We are legally required to run every single 6-figure transaction through a rigorous anti-money laundering software system." I looked directly at my brother, whose knees were actually knocking together. "When your fraudulent wire transfer hit my corporate accounts, my system immediately flagged the routing numbers." I turned my attention to Jessica, who was clutching her designer purse so tightly her knuckles were white. "Trevon has not been earning mid-6 figures, Jessica," I said, keeping my tone clinically precise. "He has been embezzling money directly from his clients' accounts at his Atlanta investment firm. He has been siphoning millions of dollars for the past 3 years, just to fund your lavish lifestyle and keep up with your old money family. He bought your designer clothes, your luxury cars, and those vintage bottles of champagne with stolen money. Jessica looked like she had been physically struck. She staggered backward, shaking her head side to side. "No," she whispered. "No, my husband is a vice president. He has a trust. Hi is a mid-level analyst who got greedy," I corrected her. "And when he tried to push $150,000 of stolen client funds through my corporate merchant accounts to pay for this yacht, my security software locked the funds and automatically notified the federal authorities." Agent Miller nodded, confirming every word I had just spoken. "We have been building a case with your firm in Atlanta for 6 months," Mr. Washington, the agent said, looking at Trayvon with pure disdain. "You got sloppy. When the Azure Seas compliance team alerted our field office about the flagged wire transfer this morning, it gave us the exact documentation we needed to secure the warrant. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering." The reality of the situation crashed into the VIP lounge with the force of a hurricane. The golden child, the man my parents had praised and pampered while treating me like garbage, was a federal criminal. All the comparisons, all the lectures about how I needed to be more like my successful brother, all the times they told me I was an embarrassment to the family name, it was all built on a massive foundation of stolen money and deceit. Agent Miller signaled to the two agents standing behind him. They stepped forward in unison. "Trayvon Washington, please put your hands behind your back." Trevin let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He slowly raised his arms, crossing his wrists behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly in the silent luxury lounge. It was the most final, devastating sound I had ever heard. Jessica completely lost whatever composure she had left. The realization that her entire marriage was a poverty-stricken lie hit her all at once. The woman who had sneered at my presence just an hour ago, who had called me ghetto and demanded I be thrown out, was now realizing she was legally married to a felon. Her precious high society reputation in Savannah was about to be dragged through the mud and splashed across the evening news. "Do not touch me!" Jessica shrieked violently, backing away as Trevon tried to look at her for comfort. "You are a disgusting fraud. You lied to me. My family accepted you and you used us to cover up your pathetic crimes." "Baby, please," Trevon begged, his voice breaking as the agents held his arms. "I did it for us. I did it because I wanted to give you the life you deserved." "Do not put this on me," Jessica screamed, her face turning bright red. She pulled her smartphone out of her purse, her hands shaking so violently she almost dropped it. "I am calling my father right now. I am calling my family lawyers, and I am filing for divorce today. Do you hear me, Trayvon? Today. I will not let my family name be ruined by a common thief." 2 weeks had passed since the federal agents escorted my brother out of the Miami marina in handcuffs. I was sitting at the massive glass desk in my penthouse corner office, overlooking the sunlit docks. The morning sun reflected brilliantly off the turquoise water, and my fleet of luxury yachts was operating at full capacity, moving wealthy clients in and out of the harbor. The soft hum of the central air conditioning and the faint distant sound of boat horns created a symphony of success. For the first time in my 35 years, I felt a profound sense of absolute peace. I had finally excised the toxic tumor that was my biological family. I spent my days negotiating international maritime contracts and my evenings enjoying the quiet sanctuary of my own hard-earned wealth. But peace is a fragile, temporary thing when you are dealing with people who refuse to accept accountability. I knew my parents would not simply retreat to Atlanta and reflect on their colossal failures. Brenda and Calvin Washington had spent decades meticulously building their entire social identity around their elevated status at our prominent, affluent African-American megachurch. In our community, the church is not just a place of weekend worship. It is the absolute epicenter of social hierarchy, networking, and reputation management. It is where business deals are made, where social standing is validated, and where family secrets are either buried or broadcasted. My parents were high-ranking members of this elite congregation. My father was a senior deacon who passed the collection plate with a gold watch on his wrist, and my mother practically ran the women's ministry, directing charity galas with an iron fist. Their standing in that community was more important to them than oxygen. And now, with their golden child, sitting in a federal holding cell, facing years in prison for millions in embezzlement, they desperately needed a scapegoat to salvage their pristine image. They could not possibly stand before their wealthy peers and admit they had raised a common thief who funded their lavish lifestyle with stolen money. So they chose the easiest, most familiar target. They chose me. According to the few loyal friends I still had in my hometown, my mother had turned her weekly prayer circle into a vicious, highly coordinated character assassination campaign. She stood before the congregation on a Sunday morning, weeping theatrical, devastating tears, painting a picture of a ruthless, money-hungry sociopath daughter who had maliciously framed her innocent brother. She told everyone that I had used my shady corporate connections in Miami to plant false financial evidence against Trevon because I was deeply jealous of his beautiful marriage and his rapid corporate success. She spun a masterful narrative, claiming that I had stolen my wealth through illicit means and was now trying to destroy the family name out of pure, unadulterated spite. My father backed up every single word, nodding solemnly from the front pews, playing the role of the heartbroken patriarch whose ungrateful daughter had betrayed her own blood. The fallout was swift and incredibly toxic. My private cell phone, which I had unfortunately not yet changed, became a dumping ground for the collective moral outrage of my extended family and the church elders. I sat at my mahogany desk, looking out at the ocean, and listened to the voicemails pouring in one after another. Aunt Patrice called first, her voice shaking with righteous indignation. "I cannot believe you would do this to your own mother, Camille," she yelled into the receiver. "You are a disgrace to black women everywhere, tearing down a successful black man just to inflate your own bitter ego. You should be ashamed of yourself for putting your brother in a cage." Uncle Thomas left a 5-minute rant quoting scriptures about honoring thy mother and father. He screamed that my soul was eternally damned for sending my own flesh and blood to a federal prison. "Family protects family no matter what," he shouted, his voice echoing in my quiet office. "You never involve the law in family business. You are a traitor to your blood." A senior church elder, an older woman I had known since childhood, left a message demanding I immediately wire the bail money for Trevon and issue a public written apology to my parents if I ever wanted to show my face in the city of Atlanta again. They called me a sellout. They called me heartless. They used every single ounce of religious guilt and systemic family pressure they could muster to force me back into submission. They leveraged the very real societal expectation that black women are supposed to absorb the trauma and mistakes of their male relatives to protect the community image. 10 years ago, those voicemails would have completely broken me. I would have internalized their venom and questioned my own sanity. I would have cried myself to sleep, wondering if maybe I really was the villain for not protecting my brother from the consequences of his own actions. But sitting in my penthouse office, surrounded by the physical manifestation of my integrity, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, sharp clarity. I did not shed a single tear. I did not draft a defensive social media post to explain my side of the story. I did not call my aunt or my uncle to justify my actions or present my evidence. I simply pressed delete on every single message. I blocked their phone numbers one by one, erasing them from my digital life just as easily as they had tried to erase my humanity for 3 decades. I refused to engage in their petty emotional warfare. Let them have their lies in Atlanta. Let them preach their fabricated victimhood to a congregation that cared more about keeping up appearances than facing the ugly truth. I had an empire to run, and I was not going to let their toxic dysfunction slow my momentum. I poured all my energy into expanding Azure Sea's charters. I called my operations manager into my office and spent 3 hours reviewing acquisition proposals for a brand new line of luxury catamarans. A highly lucrative contract to host a series of exclusive corporate retreats for a major Silicon Valley tech firm. I channeled every single ounce of residual frustration into strategic corporate ruthlessness. I was thriving. My business was scaling at an unprecedented rate, and without the constant emotional drain of my family holding me back, I felt completely unstoppable. I thought the worst was over. I thought the battle was won, and I could finally just focus on building my legacy in peace. I completely underestimated the reach of old money privilege and the vengeance of a humiliated white family. I was in the middle of reviewing a quarterly profit report when the heavy glass doors to my office swung open with a violently urgent force. Tyson, my chief of security, marched into the room. His usually calm, stoic face was tight with intense, genuine alarm. He did not bother knocking or offering his usual respectful professional greeting. He walked straight up to my desk and placed both of his massive hands flat on the glass surface, leaning in close so the administrative staff outside could not hear. "We are not just dealing with angry family gossip anymore, Camille," he said, his voice deadly serious, dropping my formal title completely. "I just got off the phone with the State Maritime Commission. They just suspended our commercial operating license effective immediately. All of our vessels are legally grounded. We cannot put a single boat in the water. Someone powerful is trying to shut us down." The heavy glass doors of my office swung shut behind Tyson, but the tension he brought into the room lingered like static electricity. "Suspended," I repeated, keeping my voice low and meticulously level. "On what grounds, Tyson?" "We just passed our annual maritime safety and environmental inspections with perfect scores last month. Every single vessel in the Azure Seas fleet is fully compliant with federal regulations." Tyson slid a thick digital document across the smooth glass surface of my desk. "They are not citing federal regulations, Camille. This order is coming directly from the State Maritime Commission. They are citing sudden anonymous reports of severe structural dock violations and potential environmental hazards. They bypassed all standard preliminary warning protocols and skipped the usual 30-day grace period for inspections. The Commission enacted a unilateral emergency freeze. As of 10 minutes ago, our corporate operating license is completely suspended. We cannot authorize a single charter. We cannot even move our own boats for routine maintenance. We are completely dead in the water." I picked up the tablet and scrolled through the official state mandate. The legal language was deliberately vague, heavily padded with bureaucratic jargon, but the actual intent was razor-sharp. This was not a routine regulatory audit or an administrative error. This was a highly targeted corporate assassination. Somebody with immense political power and deep pockets had just pulled a massive structural lever to drop a concrete wall directly in front of my business operations. I looked at the signature at the very bottom of the authorization order. The name belonged to a high-ranking state commissioner, but I knew exactly how this game was played. Career bureaucrats do not initiate sudden emergency corporate freezes on multi-million-dollar companies unless a very wealthy and very angry donor tells them to do it. "Get me the donor contribution logs for the commissioner who signed this order," I told Tyson, my mind already working 5 steps ahead of the crisis. "Cross-reference his political action committees with the maritime shipping conglomerates based out of Savannah, Georgia." Tyson nodded, pulling out his secure mobile device and already typing instructions to our intelligence team. "You think this is direct retaliation for what happened with Trevon and Jessica at the VIP lounge?" "I do not think it, Tyson, I know it." It did not take long to connect the financial and political dots. Within 15 minutes, my data analytics team had traced the bureaucratic red tape directly back to its original source. The true antagonist had finally stepped out of the shadows: Charles Montgomery. Charles was Jessica's father. He was the patriarch of an incredibly wealthy old-money white family from Savannah. The Montgomery family had built their vast generational wealth through decades of commercial shipping, aggressive real estate acquisitions, and deep-rooted political lobbying across the eastern seaboard. Charles was a man who viewed the entire state economy as his personal chessboard. How was a man who was entirely used to bending local laws, destroying smaller competitors, and making complicated problems quietly disappear with the stroke of a fountain pen. And right now I was his absolute biggest problem. Charles was furiously enraged that his precious daughter's name was currently being dragged through the mud. Trevon's federal indictment for embezzlement and wire fraud had become front-page news in the Atlanta and Miami financial sectors. The Montgomery family prided themselves on their pristine, untarnished public image. Having their daughter legally tied to a black man facing federal prison for stealing millions of dollars was a catastrophic social embarrassment that their country club peers were already gossiping about. But Charles did not blame Trevon for committing the actual crimes. In the twisted, arrogant logic of old money supremacy, Charles blamed me for exposing the crimes to the federal agents in a public setting. He blamed me for not taking the fall quietly to protect his daughter's reputation. In his eyes, the black woman who refused to stay in her designated place was the root cause of his family's public humiliation. So he decided to use his vast political connections in the State Maritime Commission to crush my company entirely and teach me a brutal lesson about power and hierarchy. I stood up from my executive desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the expansive marina. Below me, my beautiful fleet of luxury yachts sat completely idle, tied heavily to the docks. I thought about my parents, Brenda and Calvin. I thought about the decades they spent drilling fear and compliance into my head. This exact scenario was the systemic societal roadblock they had always warned me about. They constantly used powerful white men like Charles Montgomery as boogeymen to keep me small and agreeable. They told me that the corporate world was not built for people who looked like me. They insisted that if a black woman aimed too high, the system would inevitably cut her down, so it was much safer to just accept the scraps I was given and be grateful. They had weaponized systemic racism to justify their own lack of ambition and to excuse their endless financial coddling of Trevon. But I completely refused to validate their fears. I had dealt with this exact brand of entitlement my entire professional career. I knew exactly how men like Charles operated behind closed doors. They relied heavily on intimidation, financial starvation, and the sheer exhausting weight of endless bureaucracy to force their targets into submission. They expected you to panic, to cry, and to beg for mercy when the pressure became too heavy. My private office line suddenly rang. It was a secure, unlisted number that bypassed my executive reception desk entirely. Only a handful of high-level corporate partners and financial institutions had access to that specific line. I walked back to my desk and pressed the glowing speaker button. Camille Washington. I answered, my voice smooth and utterly unbothered by the ringing alarm bells in my head. A deep, gravelly voice, thick with a refined southern drawl, echoed through the spacious office. Miss Washington, this is Charles Montgomery. I imagine you are having a rather difficult morning. I sat down in my leather chair, folding my hands neatly on the glass desk. Good morning, Charles. I am having a wonderfully productive day, actually. To what do I owe the pleasure of this unexpected call? Charles let out a short, patronizing chuckle. It was a cold sound, completely devoid of any real humor or warmth. I genuinely admire your false bravado, Miss Washington. It is cute. But let us drop the corporate pleasantries. I am absolutely sure you have seen the suspension orders from the State Commission by now. I have seen some standard administrative paperwork. Yes, I replied casually, as if we were discussing a minor weather delay. I want to make my position incredibly clear to you. Charles continued, his tone hardening into a vicious, arrogant threat. You have caused my family a great deal of public embarrassment. You humiliated my daughter Jessica, and you dragged the Montgomery name into a federal scandal simply because you could not control your petty sibling rivalry. You thought you were very clever having those federal agents arrest your brother in your little VIP lounge. I did not arrest my brother Charles. The Federal Bureau of Investigation arrested him for stealing millions of dollars from his clients. I simply provided the unalterable financial logs that proved he was a thief. Charles ignored my factual correction entirely, pushing forward with his intimidation tactic. You stepped entirely out of your depth, little girl. You are playing captain in a sea that belongs to me and my family. I have spent the entire morning pulling a few strings to freeze your commercial assets. By tomorrow afternoon, I will have your corporate bank accounts locked under pending environmental investigations. By the end of the month, Azure Seas Charters will be completely bankrupt. The bank will repossess every single boat in your little fleet. He paused, letting the heavy threat sink into the silence of the room. He wanted me to understand the sheer magnitude of his systemic power. He wanted to hear the fear trembling in my voice. I am going to completely dismantle your life, Miss Washington, Charles growled. And when I am entirely done with you, you will be right back to scrubbing barnacles off the docks for minimum wage. You should never have messed with my family. I sat in my quiet office, listening to the sudden dial tone as Charles abruptly hung up the phone. He had delivered his grand villainous monologue and disconnected, believing he had just secured his ultimate victory. He fully expected me to collapse into a panic, to call my lawyers in tears, and to desperately seek a way to surrender my assets to him. I did not shed a single tear. I did not experience a single ounce of panic. I did not back down. Instead, I smiled. I turned to my primary computer monitor and typed a complex 32-character password into my encrypted private server. For the past 2 years, ever since Trevon first brought Jessica to a family dinner and aggressively bragged about her father's immense wealth, I had known exactly who the Montgomery family was. I did not just build luxury yachts and host wealthy tourists. I heavily studied every single apex predator operating in my local waters. I knew that eventually, as a highly successful black woman in the maritime industry, I would have to face men exactly like Charles. So I meticulously prepared for this exact day. I opened a heavily encrypted hidden dossier labeled Montgomery Holdings. The digital folder contained hundreds of gigabytes of raw financial data, property deeds, shell company registrations, and illegal under-the-table port leasing agreements. Charles thought he was dealing with an emotional little girl playing captain. He was about to find out he had just declared war on a corporate leviathan. I prepared to play a high-stakes corporate game he was completely unready for. The morning of the emergency suspension hearing arrived with a thick, suffocating humidity that hung heavily over the city. I did not let the weather or the incredibly high stakes of the day affect my preparation. I dressed with meticulous, deliberate intention. For a black woman walking into a room full of powerful old money white men who are actively trying to destroy her life, clothing is not just fashion, it is psychological armor. I chose a sharply tailored crimson power suit that demanded immediate attention, paired with a pair of classic black stilettos that echoed with authority against the marble floors of the state capitol building. I wore my hair pulled back into a sleek, flawless bun. I was not going to give Charles Montgomery or the State Maritime Commission a single visual reason to doubt my absolute competence. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the hearing room, the atmosphere was immediately oppressive. The room was designed to intimidate. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, and a massive elevated curved desk dominated the front of the space where 5 older white board members sat, looking down at the defense table. It was the physical manifestation of the systemic societal roadblocks my parents had always terrified me with. This was the exact room where generational wealth gathered to casually crush the ambitions of people who did not belong to their exclusive country clubs. I did not shrink under the weight of their collective stare. I walked down the center aisle with my chin held high, my posture radiating complete, unbothered confidence. As I approached the defense table, I glanced over at the public gallery section on the right side of the room. Charles Montgomery was sitting in the front row with his legs crossed casually at the knee, resting both hands on the top of a polished wooden cane. He looked like a wealthy plantation owner holding court, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of his own power. Sitting directly beside him was Jessica. She was wearing an expensive, oversized pair of designer sunglasses pushed up into her blonde hair, tapping rapidly on her phone. She looked up and caught my eye, a nasty, vindictive smirk spreading across her face. They were treating my impending corporate ruin like a morning matinee, viewing my execution as a fun family outing to avenge their bruised egos. I took my seat at the defense table, placing my sleek leather briefcase down. I did not bring a massive legal team to flank me. I sat completely alone. I could see Charles whisper something to Jessica from the corner of my eye, and they both let out a quiet, condescending laugh. They thought my solitude meant I was defenseless. They thought I could not afford high-powered representation, or that I was simply too naive to understand the legal slaughter that was about to take place. The chairman of the Maritime Board, a man whose campaign contributions were heavily funded by the Montgomery shipping empire, banged his wooden gavel to initiate the proceedings. "We are here to review the emergency suspension of the commercial operating license for Azure Seas Charters," the chairman announced, his voice dripping with bureaucratic boredom. "Miss Washington, this board has received multiple highly concerning anonymous reports regarding the structural integrity of your designated docking areas. We have been provided with documentation citing severe environmental hazards, failing wooden pylons, and improper waste disposal methods that directly violate state maritime safety codes. Due to the severe nature of these allegations, this board authorized an immediate freeze on your commercial operations pending a full investigation. The chairman looked down at me, peering over the rim of his reading glasses. The condescension in his eyes was absolute. He had already made his decision before I even walked into the room. Miss Washington, he continued, his tone mockingly patient, as if he were explaining a complex math problem to a slow child. These are incredibly serious violations. The fines alone could bankrupt a boutique operation like yours. Given the overwhelming evidence presented to us, how do you plan to defend your company against these safety hazards? I stood up slowly, buttoning the center button of my crimson jacket. I looked directly at the chairman. The chairman then let my gaze sweep across the other 4 board members before finally settling on Charles Montgomery in the gallery. Charles leaned forward slightly, a smug, satisfied smile resting on his lips, waiting for me to panic. I was waiting for me to cry, to claim I was being targeted, or to desperately beg the board for an extension to fix the fabricated issues. I did not beg, I did not panic. Mr. Chairman, I said, my voice carrying clearly and powerfully through the quiet hearing room, I am not here today to defend my company against these safety violations. In fact, I have thoroughly reviewed the structural engineering reports provided by your anonymous source, and I completely agree with their assessment. The docks in question are an absolute environmental disaster. The pylons are rotting. The infrastructure is fundamentally compromised, and the waste disposal methods are completely archaic. A wave of profound confusion washed over the room. The board members exchanged baffled glances. In the gallery, Charles Montgomery's smug smile faltered slightly, his brow furrowing as he tried to figure out what kind of strategy I was playing. Jessica stopped tapping on her phone and stared at me. They had expected a desperate fight, and my immediate surrender confused them. The chairman cleared his throat, clearly thrown off his prepared script. Well, Miss Washington, if you are openly admitting to these severe violations, then this board has no choice but to permanently revoke your commercial license and initiate asset seizure to cover the environmental fines. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my encrypted corporate tablet. I walked over to the presentation podium in the center of the room and connected my device directly to the hearing room's large projection screen. I am completely agreeing that the safety violations exist, Mr. Chairman, I clarified, tapping a sequence of commands into my tablet. What I am disagreeing with is the ownership of the liability. You see, I do not own the physical infrastructure of the docks. Azure Seas Charters simply leases the water rights from a larger parent organization known as Coastal Harbor Holdings. I pressed a button and a massive complex corporate organizational chart illuminated the projector screen behind me. Coastal Harbor Holdings has been responsible for the maintenance and structural integrity of that marina for the past 40 years, I explained, pacing slowly across the front of the room, commanding the space with absolute authority. And as you can see from the financial data currently displayed on the screen, Coastal Harbor Holdings is a deeply nested shell company that ultimately belongs to the Montgomery shipping conglomerate. I turned and pointed directly at Charles Montgomery, whose face was rapidly losing its color. Mr. Montgomery has spent the last decade intentionally neglecting the structural integrity of that marina to avoid paying state infrastructure taxes, I stated, ensuring the court stenographer was recording every single word. He funneled the maintenance budgets into his private commercial shipping accounts while letting the public docks rot into the ocean. He generated these fabricated safety reports against my company, hoping you would revoke my operating license before anyone realized he was actually the one legally responsible for the environmental hazards. He tried to use this board as a weapon to punish me for a personal family dispute. The chairman banged his gavel aggressively, his face flushing a deep, guilty red. Miss Washington, you are making wild, unsubstantiated accusations against a highly respected businessman. This board will not tolerate slander. You are facing permanent closure. I am not making accusations, Chairman. I am stating financial facts. I countered, my voice rising in power, refusing to let him silence me. And I am not facing closure. Because while Mr. Montgomery was busy calling in political favors to freeze my small fleet, I was busy reviewing the catastrophic financial health of his holding company. I tapped my screen again. A new document appeared on the projector. It was a verified stamped financial acquisition filing from the Federal Banking Reserve. Coastal Harbor Holdings was massively overleveraged, I explained, breaking down the corporate guillotine I had meticulously prepared. They were drowning in toxic debt from several failed commercial shipping ventures. So over the past 48 hours, my corporate finance team aggressively bought up every single piece of their distressed debt from their primary creditors. I purchased their debt for pennies on the dollar and immediately triggered a debt-to-equity conversion clause that Mr. Montgomery's careless lawyers left in his original holding contracts. The hearing room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the projector fan. Charles Montgomery gripped his wooden cane so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He tried to stand up, his mouth opening to speak, but no words came out. The sheer velocity of the corporate takeover had completely paralyzed him. I walked back to the defense table and picked up a thick manila folder. I walked directly up to the elevated desk where the board members sat and slid the heavy folder across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of the chairman. "That is a signed, verified, and federally stamped contract of ownership," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly serious register. "I did not come here today to fight an audit, Mr. Chairman. I came here to inform this board that a change in management has occurred. I do not just own Azure Seas Charters anymore. Through my hostile takeover of Coastal Harbor Holdings, I now own the physical land, the water rights, and the entire operational infrastructure of the Miami Marina. I just bought the entire property out from under him." I turned around and looked directly into the gallery. Charles Montgomery's smug, entitled smirk had completely vanished. He looked like a man who had just been struck by a high-speed train. His face was a sickly shade of gray, and his chest was heaving with panicked, shallow breaths. Beside him, Jessica looked absolutely horrified, finally realizing that the black woman she had called ghetto in the VIP lounge was actually a corporate titan who had just swallowed her father's legacy whole. I held Charles' gaze, letting the absolute finality of my victory crush him. He had tried to use the system to lock me out, and I had simply bought the entire system. The hearing room descended into absolute bedlam the moment I confirmed the hostile takeover of Coastal Harbor Holdings. The chairman of the State Maritime Board dropped his wooden gavel and it rolled off the elevated desk, clattering loudly onto the floor below. He stammered incoherently, shuffling through the verified federal documents I had just handed him, desperately searching for a loophole that simply did not exist. Charles Montgomery pushed himself up from the gallery bench so fast that his polished wooden cane slipped from his grasp and hit the marble floor with a sharp crack. "This is highly illegal," Charles bellowed, his deep southern drawl breaking into a frantic, gravelly shout. "You cannot just purchase a generational holding company overnight. I will have you arrested for corporate espionage. I will tie you up in federal litigation for the next 20 years, you arrogant little girl." I did not raise my voice to match his panic. I calmly closed my leather briefcase and fastened the brass clasps. I looked up at the chairman, who was sweating profusely through his expensive suit. "Mr. Chairman," I said, projecting my voice clearly over Charles Montgomery's frantic shouting. "As the new legal owner of the physical marina infrastructure, I am officially withdrawing the safety complaints against Azure Seas Charters. You no longer have jurisdiction to suspend my operating license. If this board attempts to enforce that suspension for another single second, I will hold the state personally liable for my lost daily revenue." I turned my back on the sputtering board members and walked straight down the center aisle. Charles was standing at the edge of the gallery, his face a violent shade of purple. Jessica was clutching his arm, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization that her entire old money lifestyle was built on a crumbling foundation of toxic debt. "I will see you in the executive boardroom at the marina in exactly 1 hour," Charles said without breaking my stride. "Do not be late." I pushed through the heavy oak doors and walked out into the suffocating humidity of the city. The drive back to the Miami Marina felt entirely different than the drive there. The systemic roadblocks that my parents, Brenda and Calvin, had always warned me about, the invisible walls built by wealthy white men to keep black women in their place, had just been completely demolished by my own 2 hands. I had not just broken through the glass ceiling, I had purchased the entire building. When my black car pulled up to the sleek glass and steel administrative building of the marina, my corporate attorney Valerie was already waiting for me in the lobby. Valerie was a brilliant, sharp-minded black woman who had graduated at the absolute top of her class from Harvard Law. We had spent the last 48 hours operating on zero sleep, quietly executing the most aggressive financial acquisition of our careers. She handed me a thick, leather-bound portfolio as we walked toward the private elevator. The Federal Banking Reserve fully cleared the debt to equity conversion. 20 minutes ago, Camille, she said, a fierce, proud smile playing on her lips. We executed the transition flawlessly. The board of directors for the marina is waiting upstairs. Charles beat us here. He is currently throwing an absolute tantrum, trying to force the managing directors to file an emergency injunction. Let him scream, Valerie, I replied, watching the elevator numbers tick upward. A dying dinosaur makes the most noise right before the meteor hits. The elevator doors slid open on the top floor, revealing a sprawling reception area decorated in dark mahogany and brushed steel. We walked straight down the corridor toward the executive boardroom. Even through the thick, soundproof doors, I could hear Charles Montgomery shouting. I pushed the heavy double doors open and stepped into the room. The executive boardroom was a vast, intimidating space designed to make tenants and contractors feel incredibly small. A massive 20-foot polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by plush leather executive chairs. 5 older white men, the managing directors of the marina, who had kissed Charles Montgomery's ring for decades, were seated along the sides of the table. Charles was pacing back and forth at the far end of the room, waving his arms frantically. Jessica sat in a corner chair looking completely lost. I want a court order filed immediately. Charles was screaming, pointing a shaking finger at the lead director. I want her assets frozen. I want her fleet impounded. You work for me, do you understand that? You will not let that woman take my docks. The room fell completely silent the moment my heels clicked against the hardwood floor. Charles stopped pacing. He glared at me, his chest heaving with exertion. You have absolutely no right to be in this room, he growled. This is a closed-door meeting for the Marina Board of Directors. Guest seating is outside in the lobby. I did not stop walking. I bypassed the designated guest chairs entirely. I walked straight past the 5 managing directors who were watching me with wide, apprehensive eyes. I walked all the way to the very head of the 20-foot mahogany table, to the oversized leather executive chair that was strictly reserved for the majority shareholder. I pulled the heavy chair back and sat down, placing my hands flat on the polished wood. What the hell do you think you are doing? Charles shouted, taking a threatening step forward. Get out of that chair right now. That seat is for ownership only. I know, Charles, I replied, my voice echoing with absolute icy authority. That is exactly why I am sitting in it. I gestured to Valerie, who stepped forward and began distributing copies of the authenticated federal transfer documents to each of the 5 managing directors. They scrambled to pick up the papers, their eyes darting rapidly across the legal text. As of this morning, I am the majority shareholder of Coastal Harbor Holdings, I announced, keeping my gaze locked on Charles. I own the land. I own the water rights. I own the operational infrastructure. And gentlemen, I said, turning my attention to the 5 directors sitting along the table, I now own every single one of your employment contracts. The shift in power in that room was absolute and instantaneous. These 5 men were survivalists. They were highly paid corporate bureaucrats who cared solely about their own pensions and their annual bonuses. They did not care about Charles Montgomery's legacy or his old money pride. They followed the money. The lead director, a man who had just been nodding along to Charles' furious demands 30 seconds ago, swallowed hard. He looked down at the federal banking seal on the document in front of him. He carefully folded his hands on the table and looked directly at me, completely avoiding Charles' gaze. We understand. Madam CEO, the lead director, said, his voice carrying a sudden, sickeningly polite deference. We are prepared to assist with the administrative transition in whatever capacity you require. The other 4 directors immediately murmured their agreement, nodding along and looking down at their papers. They had officially switched sides in less than a minute. They had completely abandoned Charles to save their own careers. Charles looked around the room in absolute horror. The realization that his immense political and financial influence had just evaporated into thin air finally broke his sophisticated Southern gentleman facade entirely. The man who had spent his entire life destroying smaller competitors and laughing at their misery could not handle being on the losing side of the table. He slammed both of his hands down hard on the polished mahogany. The loud crack echoed through the boardroom, causing Jessica to jump in her seat. "You cannot do this to me," Charles roared, his face twisting in unadulterated fury. "My family built this shipping empire. My grandfather laid the foundation for these docks. I demand respect. I demand you recognize who you are dealing with." I looked at him, watching a powerful man crumble under the weight of his own arrogance. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. I placed it on the table and slid it smoothly across the polished wood. It stopped right at the edge of the table, directly in front of Charles Montgomery's shaking hands. "I know exactly who I am dealing with, Charles," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. "I am dealing with a tenant who is currently trespassing on my property. I think it is time we discuss your eviction." Charles stared at the heavy manila folder resting on the polished mahogany table just inches from his shaking hands. He refused to open it. He simply glared at the thick stack of paper as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. I did not wait for his permission. I reached across the table and flipped the folder open for him, exposing the meticulously organized financial records my intelligence team had compiled over the past 2 years. I looked directly into his eyes, letting him see that the Southern gentleman intimidation tactics he had used his entire life were completely useless against me. "Let us review your legacy," Charles said, my voice steady and echoing clearly in the silent boardroom. "For the past 12 years, you have utilized a network of shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands to avoid paying state maritime taxes on your commercial shipping fleet. You used Coastal Harbor Holdings as a massive tax shelter, artificially inflating maintenance costs while letting the public docks rot into the ocean. You bribed local inspectors to look the other way, and you strong-armed the previous managing directors into giving you exclusive grandfathered leasing contracts. You have been monopolizing the prime deep water slips at this marina while paying less than a fraction of the actual market rate." The 5 managing directors, sitting along the sides of the large table, suddenly looked physically ill. The color drained from their faces as they realized I possessed the exact paper trail that proved their complicity in Charles Montgomery's illegal tax evasion schemes. They knew that if I handed those files over to the federal authorities, they would all be facing massive fines and potential prison time. They slouched down in their oversized leather executive chairs, trying to make themselves invisible. Charles clenched his jaw so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. "You have absolutely no idea how business is done in this state," he growled, his voice dropping into a vicious, threatening whisper. "You think a few spreadsheets are going to scare me? My family has been operating in these waters for generations. We built this local economy. You are just a temporary nuisance. I am the new owner." "Charles," I corrected him, leaning back in my chair and folding my hands. "And as the new owner, I am legally obligated to clean up the toxic liabilities left behind by the previous administration. Therefore, I am officially informing you that every single one of your grandfathered dock leasing contracts is permanently voided, effective immediately." Jessica gasped loudly from her corner chair, but I did not break eye contact with Charles. "Your contracts were secured through fraudulent tax reporting and illegal kickbacks." I continued, keeping my tone clinical and relentless. "That makes them legally null and void. You no longer have any right to dock your private yachts or your commercial shipping vessels at this marina. You have exactly 48 hours to completely remove your entire fleet from my waters." Charles slammed his fist onto the table. "48 hours is physically impossible, and you know it," he shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "I have 3 massive commercial freighters currently undergoing maintenance in the dry docks. I cannot move them without a coordinated tugboat fleet and state permits. You are trying to sabotage my shipping routes." "That sounds like a severe logistical problem for your logistics coordinator," I replied, offering him a cold, unsympathetic smile. "But my timeline is absolute. If a single boat belonging to the Montgomery family is still tied to my docks by Friday morning, I will have them legally impounded for trespassing. And then Charles will auction them off to the highest bidder to cover the millions of dollars in back taxes you owe the State Maritime Commission." The absolute finality of my words struck him like a physical blow. The realization that I was not bluffing, that I had the legal authority, the financial backing, and the sheer ruthlessness to seize his multi-million-dollar fleet finally shattered his arrogant facade. He looked around the boardroom, silently begging the 5 managing directors to intervene, to use their influence to save him. But the directors kept their eyes glued to the table, entirely unwilling to sacrifice their own careers to save a sinking ship. Charles was completely isolated. Jessica could no longer handle the total destruction of her privileged reality. The woman who had spent the entire morning laughing at my impending ruin suddenly jumped up from her chair. She weaponized the only tactic she had left, her tears. "You cannot do this to us!" Jessica screamed, sobbing hysterically, as she rushed toward the edge of the mahogany table. "You are a vindictive monster, Camille. First you frame my husband and send him to federal prison, and now you are trying to destroy my father's business. You are doing this just because you are jealous of me. You are ruining our lives out of pure spite because you will never be accepted in our social circles." She stood there crying loudly, expecting the white men in the room to immediately rush to her defense, to comfort her, and to reprimand the aggressive black woman making her cry. It was a societal script she had relied on her entire life. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage with her fabricated victimhood. I simply turned my head and looked toward the boardroom doors. Tyson, my towering chief of security, was standing perfectly still, waiting for my command. "Tyson," I said, my voice cutting through Jessica's theatrical sobbing like a sharp blade. "Mr. Montgomery and his daughter are officially trespassing on private corporate property. Please escort them out of the building, and make sure the administrative staff revokes their parking garage privileges on the way out." Tyson gave a firm nod. He stepped forward, signaling to the 2 armed security guards waiting in the hallway. They marched into the executive boardroom, moving with swift, tactical precision. "Do not put your hands on me!" Charles bellowed, gripping his wooden cane and raising it slightly as Tyson approached. "I know my way out of this building. You will be hearing from my legal team before the day is over." "We look forward to it," Charles replied, turning my attention back to the digital documents on my tablet. "Drive safely." Tyson and his team formed a tight physical perimeter around Charles and Jessica, leaving them no choice but to move toward the exit. Jessica continued to cry and hurl insults over her shoulder, but her words were completely ignored. I watched as the heavy soundproof doors swung shut behind them, cutting off her hysterical sobbing entirely. The silence that filled the executive boardroom was profound. It was the quiet, peaceful sound of a surgical, clean, and utterly devastating corporate victory. I looked at the 5 managing directors, who were still sitting rigidly in their chairs, waiting to see if they were next on the chopping block. "Gentlemen," I said, picking up my leather briefcase, "my corporate attorney Valerie will be sending you the new operational guidelines and the updated compliance protocols by the end of the business day. I expect zero resistance during this transition. Have a highly productive afternoon." Valerie and I walked out of the boardroom, leaving the executives to process their new reality. As we stepped into the private elevator, the heavy tension in my shoulders finally began to dissolve. We rode up to my corner office penthouse in comfortable, triumphant silence. When we walked through the glass doors of my executive suite, my core management team was already waiting. They had been monitoring the acquisition logistics from our command center, and the moment I walked in, the room erupted into cheers and applause. We popped open a chilled bottle of premium sparkling cider, filling crystal flutes to toast the flawless execution of the hostile takeover. We had successfully protected Azure Sea's charters and doubled the size of our maritime empire in a single afternoon. I walked over to the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows, holding my glass, and looked down at the sprawling marina below. The Montgomery yachts that had occupied the premium slips for decades were already scrambling to prepare for departure. The systemic roadblocks had been entirely eradicated. I took a sip of the sweet cider, letting the deep satisfaction of the moment wash over me. Just as I turned back to celebrate with my team, the secure private line on my desk began to ring. The red light flashed urgently. I set my glass down and pressed the speaker button. "Camille, it is your receptionist." The voice on the line sounded incredibly hesitant, almost nervous. "I know you asked not to be disturbed right now, but there is a situation down in the main lobby." "What is the situation?" I asked, my corporate armor sliding right back into place. "It is your father, Camille. Calvin Washington is standing down by the security desk. He looks terrible and he is practically begging to see you. He says it is an absolute family emergency, and he refuses to leave the building until he speaks with you face to face. Let him up, I told my receptionist, keeping my voice perfectly steady. Have Tyson escort him directly to my office. Do not offer him anything to drink and do not let him wander the executive floor. I pressed the button to disconnect the line and leaned back in my heavy leather chair. Valerie gave me a knowing look, quickly packing up her legal folios to give me privacy, while Tyson stepped inside the room, taking his familiar, highly intimidating position by the door. I did not have to wait long. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy frosted glass doors to my executive suite opened. My father walked into the room, and the visual transformation was absolutely jarring. The man who had stood in the luxury marina lounge just a couple of weeks ago, puffed up with patriarchal authority and country club arrogance, was completely gone. Calvin Washington looked like a hollow, empty shell of his former self. His shoulders were slumped forward under the weight of an invisible, crushing burden. The tailored suit he wore looked terribly rumpled and entirely too large for his rapidly shrinking frame. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 14 days. He stopped in the center of the expansive office, looking around at the original artwork, the panoramic ocean views, and the sheer, undeniable scale of my corporate success. I saw a brief flicker of profound regret cross his face. Not regret for how he had treated me throughout my life, but regret that he had ultimately placed all his bets on the wrong horse. Camille, my father said, his voice cracking slightly. Thank you for seeing me. I know you had every right to have your security team turn me away. I do not turn away scheduled appointments, Dad, I replied, gesturing vaguely to the guest chair across from my desk. But I am currently running a multinational maritime corporation, and I have an acquisition debrief in 15 minutes, so I highly suggest you get straight to the point. Calvin slowly sat down in the leather chair. He wrung his hands together, staring down at the smooth glass surface of my desk. He did not try to exert his usual booming authority. He completely dropped the angry patriarch act and immediately pivoted to playing the desperate, loving father. It is Trevin, Calvin whispered, looking up at me with deeply red-rimmed eyes. The federal judge denied his bail this morning. They cited the sheer volume of the stolen funds and his potential access to offshore accounts. They are transferring him to a permanent federal holding facility today. They are talking about 20 years, Camille. 20 years in a federal prison for a financial crime. I maintained absolute neutral silence. I did not offer a single word of sympathy. I simply looked at him and waited for him to finish. Calvin swallowed hard, the rising panic bleeding into his voice. And the bank in Atlanta moved forward with the foreclosure. Because the second mortgage Trevon took out was entirely fraudulent. The bank locked our retirement accounts and initiated an emergency seizure of the property. Your mother and I have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises. We are losing everything. The house, the cars are standing in the church community. We are completely ruined. I looked at the man who had happily watched my mother slap $500 on my chest. I looked at the father who had enabled a deeply toxic environment my entire life, constantly telling me that my ambitions were unrealistic, while blindly funding my brother's lavish, destructive lifestyle. That sounds like a severe legal and financial crisis, I said, my tone remaining entirely clinical and detached. But I fail to see how any of this falls under my corporate jurisdiction. Calvin leaned forward, gripping the edge of my glass desk. His eyes were wide, filled with a desperate, toxic manipulation that he had perfected over decades. Because you are the only one who has the power to fix this, he pleaded, his voice thick with unshed tears. Jessica packed her bags and left Trayvon the day after the arrest. Her father Charles officially cut us off and sicked his ruthless lawyers on us. We have absolutely nobody else to turn to. We need a high-powered federal defense attorney for Trayvon, and we need to pay off the fraudulent mortgage to save the house. The retainer for the legal team alone is astronomical. He paused, reaching deep into his arsenal of emotional triggers. He attempted to use the very same systemic fears he used to keep me small when I was a teenager. Camille, you know exactly how the justice system treats black men in this country, Calvin said, his voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. They are going to make a brutal example out of him. They are going to throw him in a cage and throw away the key just to prove a point. He is your little brother. We are family. Black families have to stick together when the system comes for us. You cannot just sit up here in your ivory tower and watch your own flesh and blood be destroyed. We need to save the family name." The sheer audacity of his words was breathtaking. It was an absolute masterclass in psychological manipulation. For 35 years, he had enthusiastically participated in tearing down my confidence. He had actively allowed my mother to drag my name through the mud at their mega church. He had watched Trevin humiliate me in front of wealthy white strangers and did absolutely nothing to intervene. And now, when his golden boy was finally facing the severe consequences of his own greedy actions, Calvin was trying to weaponize my racial identity and my familial loyalty to bail them out. He wanted me to use the very wealth he told me I would never achieve to save the son who stole from him. He wanted me to weaponize my success against a system he claimed would always defeat me. The hypocrisy was so deeply ingrained in him that he did not even realize how insulting his argument was. When I was struggling to build my business, working 18-hour days and facing discriminatory loan officers, he never once told me that Black families had to stick together. He never offered to protect me from the system. He only cared about systemic injustice when it finally showed up at his own front door to collect a legitimate debt from his favorite child. I sat in total silence, letting his desperate plea hang in the cool air of the penthouse office. I looked at his shaking hands. I looked at the tears welling in his eyes. I felt absolutely no obligation to this man. Slowly, without breaking eye contact, I reached into the top drawer of my desk. I pulled out my heavy leather-bound corporate checkbook and a solid gold fountain pen. Calvin's breath caught in his throat. I watched a massive wave of pure, unmistakable relief wash over his tired face. He watched my hands with a hungry, desperate intensity. His chest heaved with shallow breaths, and he wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his dignified persona. He was no longer a proud senior deacon. He was a beggar sitting in the court of a queen he had tried to exile. He actually believed his manipulative speech had worked. He thought the guilt trip had successfully broken my defenses, just like it always did when I was younger. He thought I was still the desperate daughter craving her father's validation, willing to buy his love at any cost. I opened the checkbook and uncapped the fountain pen. "How much is the federal legal defense retainer and the immediate bank payoff for the house?" I asked, my voice perfectly level. Calvin swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the checkbook. $2 million, he whispered. "That covers the best defense team in Atlanta and clears the fraudulent mortgage entirely. It would save everything, Camille." I nodded slowly. I pressed the gold nib of the pen to the crisp paper of the corporate check. I wrote out the date. I wrote my parents' names on the payee line. Then I carefully wrote out the amount, $2 million. I signed my name at the bottom with a sharp, decisive flourish. I tore the check from the binding. I placed my hand flat over the paper and slowly slid it across the smooth glass surface of the desk. Calvin let out a shaky breath, reaching his hand out to take it. He was practically vibrating with relief, ready to snatch the money and run right back to Atlanta to rescue his precious son. But right before his fingers could touch the paper, I stopped sliding it. I kept my index finger pinned firmly to the very center of the check, holding it completely hostage on my side of the desk. Calvin stopped freezing in place as he looked up at me in absolute confusion. The soft ambient hum of the office air conditioning was the only sound in the room. I looked into my father's eyes, letting him see the absolute unyielding authority radiating from my posture. I was not a victim anymore. I was the architect of my own reality. "You can have this, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "On one condition." Calvin stared at my finger, pressing down on the $2 million corporate check. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, tracking the slight movement of my hand, as if his entire life depended on the crisp piece of paper sitting between us. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. "Anything," he whispered, his voice cracking with pure, desperate submission. "Tell me what you want, Camille. We will do absolutely anything you ask." I did not lift my finger. I kept my gaze locked on his face, watching the complete erosion of his patriarchal pride. "I am hosting the inaugural Azure Seas Charity Gala this Saturday night. I said, my voice ringing with cool, unyielding authority. It is a massive, high-profile corporate event right here at the marina. The absolute elite of the maritime and corporate world will be in attendance. Local and national press will be covering the red carpet. Prominent members of your affluent church community in Atlanta have already RSVP'd. Calvin nodded quickly, hanging on to every single word. My condition is very simple, Dad, I continued. You and Mom are going to attend my gala. You will dress to the nines in your absolute best formal wear. You will walk the red carpet, and you will spend the entire evening mingling with my guests. You will put on brave faces, and you will publicly acknowledge my success in front of high society. You will stand by my side and pretend to be the proud, supportive parents you never were. Calvin let out a massive sigh of relief. He actually slumped forward in the leather guest chair, wiping his brow. In his mind, this was not a punishment. This was an incredibly easy price to pay. He thought I was just a desperate daughter craving her parents' public validation. He thought I was willing to hand over $2 million just to force them to acknowledge my maritime empire in front of their wealthy peers. He completely underestimated me. We will be there, Camille. Calvin promised, his voice rushing with frantic eagerness. We will be so proud. We will do exactly what you want. Thank you. Thank you so much for saving your brother. I slowly pulled the check out from under my finger. I did not hand it to him. Instead, I opened my desk drawer, placed the $2 million check inside, and locked it with a sharp metallic click. You get the check at the absolute end of the night, Dad, I said, leaning back in my executive chair. Do not be late. Saturday evening arrived with a breathtaking ocean breeze that swept across the Miami waterfront. The Azure Seas Charity Gala was the most highly anticipated corporate event of the season. I had spared absolutely no expense. The venue was an expansive open-air pavilion positioned directly on the docks, completely surrounded by my illuminated fleet of luxury mega yachts. Crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring canvas canopy, casting a warm golden glow over the polished dance floor. Waiters in crisp, black uniforms circulated through the massive crowd, carrying silver trays of premium champagne and gourmet hors d'oeuvres. The guest list was a flawless representation of Black excellence and corporate power. Politicians, high-powered maritime executives, celebrity clients, and prominent community leaders from across the eastern seaboard filled the venue. The air buzzed with the sound of clinking glasses, jazz music, and high-level networking. I stood on the wraparound balcony of the second-floor VIP mezzanine, looking down at the magnificent sea of people. I held a crystal flute of champagne in my hand, keeping myself hidden from the main floor as I watched the grand entrance. Right on time, Brenda and Calvin Washington walked down the red carpet. They were dressed to the absolute nines. Calvin wore a sharp-tailored tuxedo, and Brenda wore a stunning emerald green evening gown that hugged her figure perfectly. From a distance, they looked like the ultimate powerful, supportive parents. But looking closely, I could see the rigid tension in their posture. They were terrified. They were operating on pure survival instinct, desperately putting on a brave face, while their entire world crumbled behind the scenes. Trevin was sitting in a federal holding cell without bail, and their home was weeks away from total bank foreclosure. They needed my locked desk drawer more than they needed oxygen. Yet the sheer audacity of my mother was truly a spectacle to behold. Within 15 minutes of entering the ballroom, Brenda completely immersed herself in the performance. I watched from the balcony as she seamlessly slipped back into her toxic, comfortable role as the matriarch holding court. She mingled with the wealthy corporate guests and the familiar faces from our Atlanta megachurch. She laughed her bright theatrical laugh, tossing her head back and sipping her champagne as if she did not have a single care in the world. I watched her corner a group of powerful maritime investors. I could not hear her words over the jazz band, but her body language was unmistakable. She was gesturing proudly toward the massive yachts docked outside, claiming credit for the empire she had actively tried to destroy. She was acting as if she were the proud visionary mother who had built my confidence and guided my success every single step of the way. She was wrapping herself tightly in the warmth of my glory, entirely willing to exploit my achievements to elevate her own social standing in front of the press and high society. She thought she had won. She believed that the $2 million check waiting in my office was a guarantee. She thought my desire to have my parents at my corporate gala meant she was forgiven, and her sins were washed away by my success. Tyson, my chief of security, stepped out onto the balcony and stood silently beside me. He looked down at the ballroom floor, tracking Brenda and Calvin as they worked the room. "The audio technicians are holding the cue," Camille Tyson said, his deep voice barely rising above the music. "The presentation files are loaded, and the main screens are standing by. We are completely ready whenever you give the word." I took one final slow sip of my champagne. The cool liquid did nothing to quench the fiery absolute clarity burning in my chest. I looked down at Brenda, who was currently smiling for a society photographer, posing perfectly in her emerald gown. "It is time," I said, handing my empty glass to Tyson. I turned away from the balcony and walked down the grand sweeping staircase that led directly to the main ballroom floor. The low murmur of the wealthy crowd began to shift as people noticed my descent. Conversations paused and eyes turned toward the center of the room. The jazz band smoothly faded their music out, bringing a sudden heavy anticipation to the air. The lights dim. I step up to the main stage microphone, gesturing for my parents to come stand in the front row where everyone can see them. The soft glow of the stage lights illuminated the faces of the hundreds of guests gathered before me. I adjusted the microphone stand, listening to the brief, sharp feedback echo across the open-air pavilion. Down in the very front row, Brenda and Calvin eagerly took their places. They pushed past a few prominent local politicians to make sure they were standing dead center, right where the society photographers could capture their best angles. Brenda smoothed the fabric of her emerald green gown and offered me a massive glowing smile. She actually thought this was it. She believed I was about to hand her a $2 million check and publicly thank her for being the driving force behind my maritime empire. I looked at the crowd. I saw my loyal team members. I saw wealthy investors. I saw the elite members of the Atlanta megachurch who had spent the last 2 weeks spreading my parents' vicious lies about me. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice steady and commanding. "Thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate the expansion of Azure Seas Charters. When you build an empire from the ground up, you learn very quickly that success is not just about capital or market share. It is about accountability. Corporate accountability, and more importantly, personal accountability. You cannot build a lasting legacy on a foundation of lies." I paused, letting the words settle over the quiet ballroom. I looked directly down at my parents. "My parents, Brenda and Calvin Washington, are standing right here in the front row," I said, gesturing toward them. The crowd offered a polite, warm round of applause. Brenda practically beamed, soaking up the attention. She waved graciously to the people standing behind her, entirely consumed by the spotlight. "A few days ago, my father came into my corporate office." I continued, keeping my tone conversational but precise. "He came to me in a state of absolute desperation. As many of you may have read in the financial news, my brother Trayvon was recently arrested by federal agents for embezzling millions of dollars from his investment firm." The polite smiles in the room instantly vanished. A heavy, uncomfortable tension rippled through the crowd. "You do not bring up federal indictments at a high society charity gala." People began to shift in their seats, exchanging nervous, confused glances. Down in the front row, Brenda's waving hand slowly dropped to her side. Her smile froze completely. "My parents are currently facing the total foreclosure of their retirement home because my brother forged their signatures to secure a fraudulent mortgage," I explained, laying out the undeniable facts for all of their wealthy peers to hear. "My father sat in my office and begged me for a $2 million check. He needed it to pay off the bank and to fund a high-powered legal defense team for my brother. He told me that Black families need to stick together. He told me I needed to save the family name." I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored crimson blazer. I pulled out the crisp corporate check I had written in my office. I held it up between my fingers so the bright stage lights caught the paper. "I told my father he could have this $2 million on one single condition," I announced, my voice projecting powerfully over the silent crowd. "I told him I required absolute transparency. Because for 35 years my parents have operated in the shadows. They have weaponized their social standing in our church community to tear down my character while blindly protecting a son who was actively stealing from his own clients. Tonight, we are practicing absolute transparency. I pulled my smartphone from my other pocket. I looked up at the sound booth on the second floor balcony and gave my audio technician a firm nod. The main speakers in the pavilion emitted a soft digital chime, confirming my phone was successfully synced to the state-of-the-art sound system. I looked back down at Brenda. Her face had lost all of its color. The vibrant, arrogant energy she had carried into the gala was completely gone. She looked like a woman standing on the tracks watching a freight train barreling toward her. Transparency means bringing the ugly things into the light, I said, tapping the screen of my phone. A few weeks ago, my mother called to leave me a very nasty voicemail, but when she finished screaming at me, she forgot to actually hit the end call button on her smartphone. The line kept recording while she walked into the kitchen to speak privately with my father. Calvin suddenly lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the stage. "Camille, do not do this," he pleaded, his voice a frantic, terrified whisper. "Please, we had a deal." "We did have a deal, Dad," I replied coldly, "and I am delivering my end of it right now." I pressed play on my screen. The audio recording blared through the massive concert-quality speakers, echoing across the entire marina for every single guest to hear. Brenda's sharp, unmistakable voice filled the pavilion. "Calvin, stop pacing around the kitchen," Brenda said through the speakers, her recorded voice sounding callous and entirely ruthless. "I know Trevon has been taking money from those corporate accounts. I have known for years. He told me about it when he bought Jessica that first diamond ring. But we are absolutely not letting him go down for this. We will just tell the church board that Camille was secretly managing his personal books. She is strong enough to take the fall and rebuild herself. Trevon is not. He is our special boy, Calvin. He needs us to protect him from the authorities." The audio file ended, leaving a dead ringing silence in its wake. For 3 entire seconds, nobody in the massive venue moved or breathed. The sheer sociopathic cruelty of the recording paralyzed the room. Then the crowd erupted. The gasp that tore through the ballroom was absolutely deafening. It was a collective, visceral sound of pure horror. The wealthy elite, the corporate investors, and the prominent church elders who had listened to Brenda's weeping victim routine just a week ago were staring at her with unadulterated disgust. The public humiliation was absolute and immediate. I watched the exact moment Brenda and Calvin's social standing was vaporized into dust. An older woman from our Atlanta megachurch, a woman who had left me a nasty voicemail calling me a traitor to my blood, actually covered her mouth and turned her back on my mother in pure revulsion. People began stepping away from my parents, treating them like they carried a highly contagious disease. The society photographers who had been capturing the glamour of the night suddenly rushed forward, their camera flashes blindingly bright as they documented the total destruction of the Washington family legacy. Brenda stood frozen, staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, to try and spin some kind of desperate lie, but the irrefutable evidence of her own recorded voice had completely destroyed any chance of salvation. She had plotted to send her own daughter to federal prison to protect a thief. There was no coming back from that. I looked down at the $2 million check still held tightly in my hand. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I gripped the top edge of the check and tore it perfectly down the middle. "This luxury cruise is exclusively for successful family members," my mother declared, her voice carrying sharply across the quiet elegance of the marina lobby. I simply reached into my leather tote, pulled out my matte black master keycard, and smiled. "Well, it is my yacht," I replied. I watched the glossy VIP boarding passes literally slip from my sister-in-law's fingers and flutter to the imported marble floor. "My name is Camille. I am 35 years old, and I recently learned that the people who share your blood will happily drown you if it means they can use your body as a raft. If you have ever been the black sheep of your family, the one who had to build your own table because they refused to give you a seat, stay with me. You will want to hear exactly how this family vacation ended." The air conditioning inside the ultra-exclusive VIP boarding lounge of the Miami luxury marina was crisp, smelling faintly of sea salt and expensive citrus perfume. I stood near the frosted glass entrance, holding my simple tailored bag, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart. I had barely stepped foot onto the polished stone floor when my mother Brenda intercepted me. She moved with that terrifying, frantic energy she always reserved for moments when she felt her carefully curated upper-middle-class Atlanta image was being threatened. She wore a pristine white resort dress, her hair pressed into an immaculate bob, and her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Before I could even say hello, she aggressively stepped directly into my personal space, blocking my path deeper into the lounge. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a crisp $500 bill, and slapped it directly against my chest. The bill fluttered down, and I had to catch it against my blouse just to keep it from falling to the floor. "Take a cab back to whatever little boat cleaning gig you are working down here," she hissed, her voice a harsh whisper that still managed to carry to the nearby tables. "Do not do this to us today, Camille. We are not doing this." I looked at the money in my hand, and then up at the woman who gave birth to me. The patrons in the lounge, predominantly wealthy, older white couples, were beginning to turn their heads, pretending not to watch the sudden spectacle. My mother had always cared infinitely more about the opinions of wealthy strangers than the feelings of her own daughter. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta, I was constantly reminded that my hustle was an embarrassment to her. While she wanted a daughter who attended the right social events, married a prominent doctor, and hosted charity luncheons, I was the girl with a relentless drive, always working, always building something out of nothing. She spent my entire life treating my ambition as a character flaw. "I am not here to clean boats, Mom," I said, keeping my voice absolutely level. "I came because I saw the booking under our family name." "Do not lie to me," Brenda snapped, stepping closer, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "You saw pictures on social media, and you came down here looking for a handout. Well, you are not ruining this trip. Your brother worked too hard for this. Take the money and leave before you embarrass us in front of the marina staff." I held the $500 bill out, offering it back to her. "I do not want your money. I just want to know why my entire family flew to Miami for a luxury cruise and decided to leave me off the group chat." Brenda refused to take the bill back. Instead, her hand darted out, and her manicured fingers gripped my wrist with surprising vicious strength. Her nails dug into my skin. "If you do not turn around and walk out those doors right now, I will call security and have the hired help throw you out," she threatened, her eyes wide with panic. "I will not let you ruin this before Trayvon sees you." I looked down at her hand on my wrist. For 35 years, I had let this woman dictate my worth. I had let her convince me that my natural hair, my practical clothes, and my relentless work ethic made me less valuable than the pristine, fragile image she projected to her church friends. But I was not that scared little girl seeking her approval anymore. I gently but firmly peeled her fingers off my wrist. "You do not need to call security, Mom," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "I will go say hello to Trevon myself." I stepped around her, leaving her sputtering in shock, and walked deeper into the expansive lounge. The space was designed for ultimate luxury, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the private docks where massive multi-million-dollar yachts bobbed gently in the turquoise water. And there, lounging on a plush circular leather sofa right in the center of the room, was my younger brother Trevon. Trevon was 32 years old, and the undisputed golden child of the Washington family. He was wearing a custom linen suit unbuttoned at the collar, looking every bit the successful corporate executive he desperately wanted people to believe he was. He was swirling vintage champagne in a crystal flute-holding quart. Beside him sat his wife, Jessica. Jessica was a wealthy white woman from a prominent Savannah family who had always looked at me like I was an unpleasant stain on her expensive upholstery. As I approached the seating area, Jessica spotted me first. Her perfectly glossed lips curled into a deep sneer. "Trevon." She sighed loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Why is your sister here? I thought we agreed this was a high-level family trip. Her ghetto presence is literally embarrassing us in front of the concierge." Jessica weaponized her privilege effortlessly, using words like ghetto to describe me, simply because I wore a tailored pantsuit instead of resort wear, and carried myself with a quiet authority rather than loud entitlement. Trevon turned his head, his smile vanishing the moment his eyes locked onto mine. He set his champagne flute down heavily on the glass table. "Camille, what are you doing here?" Trevon demanded, refusing to stand up to greet me. "Mom tried to pay me $500 to leave," I said, dropping the crisp bill onto the table next to his champagne. I figured I would come ask the host of this fabulous trip why his only sister was uninvited. Trevon leaned back, crossing his arms with incredible arrogance. "Because we are celebrating my recent VP promotion at the investment firm," he announced, making sure his voice projected across the lounge. I chartered a $150,000 luxury yacht to treat my parents to the vacation they deserve. We wanted a peaceful, elevated environment. Having you here constantly talking about your struggles or asking for loans just does not fit the aesthetic of this trip. The audacity of his words hit me like a physical blow, but I refused to show it. My parents had walked up behind me now, forming a united front with my brother. My father Calvin finally spoke. Calvin was a quiet man, but his silence had always been an active choice to enable my mother and brother. "Your brother is doing big things," Camille, my father said, placing a proud hand on Trevon's shoulder. "He is the only one who made something of the family name. We just wanted 1 week to celebrate his corporate success without any drama." I looked at my father, the man who 10 years ago sat at our kitchen table and flatly refused to co-sign a $50,000 business loan for me. I had come to him with a meticulously researched business plan, a solid credit score, and a desperate plea for a chance. He had told me then that giving money to a black woman with pipe dreams was a terrible investment. He told me to be realistic and get a safe desk job. Yet over the last decade, I knew for a fact he had bailed Trayvon out of 2 wrecked luxury cars, a mountain of credit card debt, and a failed startup attempt. "So my lifestyle is too mediocre for this luxury trip?" I asked, keeping my tone dangerously calm. Trayvon scoffed, picking up his champagne again. "Look, Camille, you chose your path. You want to hustle in the dirt cleaning boats and running whatever little side gigs you do, that is fine. But this is the big leagues. We are dealing with Azure Seas charters. This is for successful family only." He reached into his designer pocket, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and tossed it so it landed on the floor right at the tip of my leather loafers. "That is for the bus ride back to your apartment," he sneered. Jessica giggled, leaning her head on his shoulder. The lounge felt entirely still. I could feel the collective breath of my family waiting for me to break. They expected the familiar routine. They expected me to raise my voice, to cry, to storm out in a cloud of bitter resentment, so they could shake their heads and validate their narrative that I was unstable and jealous. Instead, I looked down at the $20 bill on the marble floor. A strange, absolute calm washed over my entire body. I looked back up at Trayvon, then at Jessica, then at my parents. I smiled. It was a cold, genuine smile that made my mother take a sudden, uncertain step backward. I slowly reached my hand into my designer tote bag. My fingers closed around the smooth, cool plastic of my keycard. I pulled it out and held it up between my index and middle finger. It was a matte black master keycard, thick and heavy, bearing the gold-embossed insignia of Azure Seas Charters, the very same logo printed on the frosted glass doors of the lounge. "You are absolutely right, Mom," I said, my voice ringing with crystal-clear authority. "This cruise is for successful family only, which is exactly why every single one of you is currently trespassing on my property." Trevon stared at the black card, then let out a loud, barking laugh. "Are you out of your mind?" he mocked, shaking his head. "Did you steal a housekeeper's keycard, Camille? Are you seriously trying to pretend you work for the marina now?" I did not have to answer him, because at that exact moment, the heavy mahogany double doors leading from the private management dock swung wide open. The most powerful lesson I learned from this ordeal is that sharing DNA does not automatically make someone family. Real family is built on mutual respect and genuine support, not toxic expectations and financial entitlement. When the people who are supposed to protect you try to tear you down, you must be brave enough to build your own empire and lock them out of the gates. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. True power comes from recognizing your own unshakable worth, setting absolute boundaries, and unapologetically sailing away from those who only wanted you to drown. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to share your own story in the comments below.